The ambient temperature in the Manhattan penthouse was calibrated to an exact, unvarying 72 degrees, a suffocating, manufactured warmth that felt increasingly like a gilded cage. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, a brutal winter storm was battering New York City. The rain was sleet, slashing aggressively against the windows and blurring the chaotic, amber glow of the city lights below into distorted streaks of gold. From this elevation, 60 floors above the freezing, slush-choked streets of the financial district, the violence of the storm was rendered entirely silent. It was a perfect, soundproofed vacuum. I sat at the edge of the heavy mahogany dining table, my spine rigid, my fingers hovering over the illuminated keyboard of my laptop. The blue light from the screen cast long, harsh shadows across the polished wood, illuminating the small, matte black encrypted USB drive plugged into the side port, the Moretti ledger. The object was deceptively small for the sheer volume of ruin it contained. For the past 4 hours, I had been submerged in the labyrinthine offshore accounts of Dante Moretti's import logistics firm. I hadn't moved. I hadn't eaten. My analytical brain had locked onto a structural flaw, and I had chipped away at the internal firewalls until the devastating truth spilled out in raw, irrefutable data. A 3% discrepancy. In a multi-billion-dollar underworld syndicate, a 3% variance in the Southern Shipping Logistics column wasn't a rounding error. It screamed like a siren in a silent room. It was a deliberate, highly sophisticated hemorrhage of capital. Enormous sums of dollars were being systematically siphoned out of the Moretti organization, filtered through a web of shell corporations in the Caymans, and redirected to purchase untraceable tactical arms for the rival faction operating out of the southern ports. It was an inside job. A betrayal at the highest echelon of Dante's command, executed by someone who understood his financial architecture intimately. My pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my throat. The math didn't lie. People lied, smiles lied, but numbers were absolute. By bypassing his security protocols to find the leak he suspected was just a mid-level manager's gambling debt, I had uncovered a coup, and by possessing this knowledge, I had just inadvertently painted an immense glowing target on my own back. If the mole realized I had decrypted the offshore routing numbers, my life expectancy would drop to roughly 0. I was a freelance forensic accountant, not a soldier. I saved children for a living, specifically my 19-year-old sister, Elena, whose failing lungs required continuous, staggering medical expenses. I couldn't afford to be collateral damage in a mafia war. The heavy, steel-reinforced double doors of the penthouse elevator chimed softly. The barometric pressure in the room shifted violently. It wasn't just the displacement of air. It was a sudden, heavy suffocation that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. Every survival instinct I possessed, honed over years of navigating predatory corporate environments in poverty, flared to life in a blinding flash of somatic hypervigilance. Dante stepped out of the elevator. He was a towering, imposing shadow against the muted lighting of the foyer, his sheer physical dimensions making the expansive, open-concept living space suddenly feel claustrophobic. He wore a dark charcoal bespoke suit, tailored flawlessly to the broad, muscular lines of his chest and shoulders. The fabric was immaculate, but the man wearing it radiated a dark, kinetic violence that had not yet settled. He brought the scent of the outside world with him, a sharp, intoxicating blend of freezing night air, expensive Italian leather, cedar, and the faint, undeniable copper of blood. His eyes, the color of frozen whiskey, swept the room with the predatory calculation of a wolf assessing a trap. They bypassed the luxury of the velvet sofas, ignored the crackling gas fireplace, and locked entirely onto me. I didn't flinch. I forced my hands to remain steady as I reached forward, my fingers gripping the edges of the laptop. The silence stretching between us was absolute. He moved with a terrifying liquid grace toward the dining table, unbuttoning his suit jacket with one hand. "You were supposed to stop at the internal logistics audit, Clara," Dante stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated straight through the floorboards and settled heavy in my chest. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "Why are you still accessing the offshore servers at 9 o'clock at night?" "Because your internal audit was a smokescreen," I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the tremors shaking my knees beneath the table. "You told me you suspected a mid-level manager was skimming to pay off debts. That was a lie. The structural decay goes much deeper, and you knew it." Dante stopped at the edge of the mahogany table, looking down at the screen. The flickering blue light illuminated the sharp, unforgiving angles of his jaw. He didn't look surprised, he looked dangerous. Disconnect the drive, Clara. I found a 3% discrepancy in the southern shipping routes, I continued. Refusing to break eye contact, refusing to back down. Capital is bleeding out of your accounts, filtered into weapons for the rival faction. You have a mole in your inner circle, Dante. Someone with executive clearance. I have the routing numbers, I have the shell companies. Let me finish the decryption. I can pinpoint exactly who is funding the coup. I said, he murmured, his voice dropping to a register that rattled my ribs, becoming softer and infinitely more lethal. Disconnect the drive. No. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The sudden movement was a physical manifestation of my refusal to be managed. I am the outside contractor who found the structural flaw in your empire. I am already exposed. If I don't control the variables of my own survival, I die. Elena dies, I have to know the truth. Dante's eyes narrowed, a barely perceptible shift in his stoic expression. He slowly pulled off his leather driving gloves, finger by finger, tossing them onto the table. The casual movement was terrifying in its precision. He closed the remaining distance between us, rounding the table and stepping into my personal space. I had to tilt my head up to maintain eye contact. The raw, imposing heat radiating off his body was a direct contrast to the freezing draft I knew was raging outside the glass. A sensory contradiction that made my head spin. Do you think you are invisible? He demanded quietly. Do you think the encryption on your little machine hides the fact that you bypassed my firewall? The moment you dug into the offshore accounts, you put a beacon on your own head. The men orchestrating this coup do not care about your intellect, Clara. They do not care about your sister's medical debts. They will use you as leverage. Or they will put a bullet in your spine to plug the leak. Then let me help you dismantle them. I fired back, my hands curling into fists at my sides. I solved the puzzle you refused to let me see. I am a forensic accountant. I dismantle empires for a living. I can track the money faster than your enforcers can break bones. Treat me like a partner, not a liability. Suddenly, his large hand came up, his long, calloused fingers wrapping gently but immovably around my jaw. The touch was shocking, warm, firm, grounding, instantly a jolt of electricity straight to my core. His thumb brushed over my cheekbone, a gesture agonizingly tender, compared to the violent tension rolling off his shoulders. He tipped my head back slightly, forcing me to look deep into the dark, swirling depths of his gaze. In my world, Dante whispered, his face lowering until his lips were mere inches from mine, his breath fanning across my skin. When I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely. You do not solve my wars. Clara, you do not bleed for my sins. If we do this, if we become this, you are mine, fully, and I don't share, I don't let go. You will sit in the safety of the fortress I built for you, and you will let me slaughter the monsters at the gates. The words were a dark, possessive promise, dripping with an archaic brand of loyalty that thrilled the deepest, most exhausted parts of my soul. But my rational mind, the mind that had kept me and my sister alive through years of grinding poverty and systemic betrayal, screamed in protest. I am not a pet to be kept in a vault, I choked out, shoving his hand away. The sudden rejection caused a flash of dark fury to ignite in his whiskey eyes, but he let his hand drop. I took a step back, my chest heaving. I have survived my entire life without a savior. I dragged my sister out of the gutter. I built my career on being smarter and faster than the men who tried to crush me. I will not trade my autonomy for a gilded cage. Your autonomy cannot stop bleed, Clara, he countered, his voice cracking like a whip. Your logic does not negotiate with a cartel hit squad. And your silence doesn't stop my fear, I yelled back, the frustration of the past few days finally boiling over into a raw, unfiltered confession. Every time you walk out that door, you smell like blood and gunpowder, and you refuse to tell me if you're ever coming back. You demand my total surrender, but you give me nothing but shadows. You lied to me about the shipping route to keep me compliant. You want to control me because you think my intelligence is a risk you have to manage. The accusation hung in the heavy air of the penthouse, vibrating with an undeniable, devastating weight. Dante froze. The anger rolling off him seemed to solidify into something entirely different, something cold, impenetrable, and terrifyingly remote. The muscles in his jaw flexed as he stared down at me. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at me, dissecting the absolute truth of my defiance, seeing past the defensive shields to the deeply wounded, exhausted woman underneath. He realized I was not going to yield. I was not going to blindly trust a man who withheld the very data I needed to calculate my own survival. He looked away first, his gaze drifting to the flashing cursor on my laptop screen, before turning back to me with a dark, calculated resignation. "Take your drive," Dante commanded, his tone completely devoid of warmth. It was a dismissal, a severing of the invisible tether that had been pulling us together. "Pack your laptop. If you want to face the reality of the underworld on your own terms, I will not force you to stay in my cage." The words felt like a physical blow to my sternum. I had demanded my independence, but hearing him grant it, hearing the absolute finality in his voice, made my stomach plummet. I wanted him to fight for the partnership. Instead, he was letting me walk into the crossfire. "Fine," I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. I turned my back to him, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the laptop as I closed it. I reached out and yanked the Moretti ledger from the USB port, clutching the matte black metal tightly in my palm. The physical weight of it was nothing compared to the metaphorical weight of what it represented. I shoved both into my leather messenger bag, slinging the strap over my shoulder. I didn't look at him as I walked toward the elevator. I couldn't. If I looked back into those whiskey eyes, I knew my resolve would shatter, and I would surrender exactly the way he wanted me to. I pressed the call button. The steel doors slid open immediately. "The cold outside is merciless tonight, Clara," Dante said quietly to my back, his voice echoing in the vast space of the penthouse. It wasn't a comment about the weather. It was a warning about the world I was walking back into without his protection. I exited the elevator, turning around to face him as the doors began to close. He remained standing in the center of the room, a solitary, untouchable king in a fortress of glass and marble, watching me leave. "I've survived the cold my whole life," I said, lifting my chin. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of him, and the elevator began its rapid, stomach-dropping descent down 60 floors. The silence inside the steel box was deafening. The manufactured warmth of the penthouse clung to my clothes for a few fleeting seconds, before the chill of the shaft began to seep through the walls. Goosebumps erupted violently along my forearms, and the sharp, damp draft stung the back of my throat like swallowed glass. I leaned my head against the cold metal panel, closing my eyes as a single, treacherous tear escaped, tracing a hot path down my cheek. I had won the argument, I had kept my autonomy. So why did it feel like I had just made the most catastrophic miscalculation of my life? The cab ride back to Queens was a miserable, jolting blur of freezing rain and hydroplaning tires. It cost me $47. Money I absolutely did not have to spare, but taking the subway with the syndicate's unencrypted financial ruin in my bag was a risk even my exhausted brain refused to take. I spent the entire 40-minute ride, gripping the strap of my bag, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, hyper-aware of every set of headlights trailing us through the sleet. When I finally pushed open the door to my apartment, the contrast was violently jarring. There was no soundproofed vacuum here. The wind howled through the poorly insulated window frames, rattling the cracked glass in a constant, nerve-shredding rhythm. The air was stale, smelling faintly of old cooking oil and damp plaster. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the medical oxygen concentrator in the corner of the living room was a sound I had long ago conditioned myself to ignore. It operated at a steady 45 decibels, a constant, vibrating reminder of exactly how fragile our existence was. Every inhale my younger sister took was subsidized by that machine, and every rotation of its internal compressor was a metronome ticking away my dwindling bank account. Elena was curled on the faded beige sofa, a thick wool blanket pulled up to her chin. The pale, translucent quality of her skin under the harsh fluorescent overhead light made the dark shadows beneath her eyes look like fresh bruises. She was asleep, the plastic tubing of the nasal cannula resting securely against her face. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the heavy leather strap of my messenger bag digging into my shoulder, just watching her chest rise and fall. Children and sick family members were targets. Liabilities. Anyone in my position knew better than to give the world that kind of leverage. But she was all I had. She was the reason I fought so viciously for every dollar, the reason I refused to be a passive asset in a mafia war. I moved quietly, shrugging off my damp coat and double-checking the locks on the front door. The heavy deadbolts slid into place with a definitive, metallic thud. The sound offered a pathetic illusion of security, compared to the armored fortress I had just walked away from. I walked into the small kitchen and sat down at the scratched formica table. The cold linoleum seeped through the soles of my boots. I reached into my bag and pulled out the Moretti ledger, placing the sleek, black USB drive on the center of the table. It looked entirely out of place in this environment. A high-tech piece of underworld architecture, resting on cheap, peeling laminate. I wrapped my icy, trembling hands around a chipped ceramic mug that had been sitting in the sink, staring blankly at the drive. The adrenaline of the confrontation was beginning to crash, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. I had walked out on the most dangerous man in the city. I had demanded a partnership from a predator who only understood possession. But the fear of the target on my back was instantly eclipsed by the overwhelming need to finish the puzzle. My intellect was my only weapon. I flipped open the laptop, bypassing the local security layers, and inserted the drive. For the next 6 hours, the Queen's apartment dissolved around me. There was only the harsh blue glow of the screen and the relentless logic of the spreadsheet. I traced the 3% variance down through the sediment of 50 different offshore accounts. My fingers flew across the keyboard, writing rapid extraction scripts to pull the routing IP addresses from the Cayman servers. I cross-referenced the capital hemorrhages with the dates of known weapons shipments that had hit the southern docks over the past quarter. The numbers interlocked flawlessly. A beautiful, terrifying tapestry of treason. By 4 a.m, I had the name. An executive vice president in Dante's logistics firm. He hadn't just been skimming. He had built a secondary financial pipeline right under Dante's nose. The sheer audacity of it was staggering, and I held the absolute proof. I rubbed my burning eyes, the chill of the apartment finally seeping deep into my bones. My joints ached with an intense, localized cold. The screen of my smartphone sat dark on the edge of the table. Dante hadn't called. He hadn't sent a team of enforcers to drag me back. He was letting me feel the absolute, crushing weight of my independence, letting the silence do the work his words couldn't. I reached out, tracing the cold metal casing of the drive with the tip of my index finger. The tactile sensation sent a shiver up my arm. I was terrified. But as I listened to the steady hum of Elena's oxygen machine, my resolve hardened into something brittle and sharp. I would not crawl back to him and beg for a spot in his gilded cage. I would force him to see my value. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over his name. Just Dante, no last name, no title. An intimacy that now felt like a gaping wound. Block caller. The confirmation prompt flashed on the screen. I pressed it. The digital tether severing felt almost physical, a snap of tension behind my ribs. If Dante Moretti wanted me, he was going to have to step out of the shadows and meet me in the light. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead. I hadn't slept. I had spent the remaining dark hours meticulously backing up the decrypted files from the Moretti ledger onto a secure offshore cloud server, building a digital dead man switch. If I disappeared, the files would automatically dump to 3 federal agencies. It was a crude insurance policy against a syndicate that specialized in making people vanish. But it was all I had. When I unlocked my phone to check Elena's pharmacy refill status, the notifications flooded the screen. 12 missed calls, all from restricted numbers. Dante didn't use restricted numbers when he called me. He used a heavily encrypted line that always displayed as a blank void. But 12 missed calls in the span of 3 hours meant the fortress was restless. Below the call log was a single, unread text message that had somehow bypassed the block I placed on his primary line. Return, 1 word. A command, not a request. I stared at the harsh white text against the black screen, my heart rate kicking up a notch, an involuntary response I'd stopped trying to control weeks ago. I deleted the thread. I spent the morning running the brutal, repetitive logistics of poverty. Elena needed her quarterly pulmonary assessment at the clinic by early afternoon, which meant navigating the icy sidewalks of Queens while calculating exactly how many hours of freelance auditing I needed to take on to cover the copay. The discrepancy on Dante's ledgers might have been a multi-million-dollar war. But in my apartment, survival was measured in the $45 it cost for an Uber and the agonizing calculus of grocery bills. I made her tea, adjusted her cannula, and wrapped a heavy scarf around her neck before setting up the medical transport. At 2:14 in the afternoon, the slate-gray sky was pressing down heavily on the city, threatening another round of freezing rain. I was walking down a narrow, slush-filled street 3 blocks from Elena's clinic, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my worn wool coat, my breath plumed in the frigid air. The street was relatively empty, the usual foot traffic deterred by the biting wind. The low, powerful purr of a high-performance engine cut through the ambient noise of the city. A sleek, armored black SUV pulled seamlessly to the curb right beside me, its tires crunching over the iced asphalt. My entire body locked up. The predatory design of the vehicle was unmistakable. It didn't belong in this borough. It belonged to the upper echelon of the underworld, a moving fortress designed to withstand ballistics and explosions. The rear passenger door didn't open. Instead, the driver's side door unlatched, and a man emerged into the freezing wind. Marcello Rossi, Dante's personal driver and right-hand enforcer. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and lethal discipline, dressed in a black tailored overcoat that concealed the inevitable weaponry strapped to his chest. He moved around the front of the vehicle with silent, effortless efficiency, his dark eyes scanning the perimeter before locking onto me. I took a step back, my hand instinctively tightening around the strap of my messenger bag, where the Moretti ledger rested against my hip. I was exposed, completely vulnerable on a public street. "Clara," Marcello said, his tone a deep rough rasp that carried over the wind. He didn't approach aggressively, he maintained a precise, calculated distance, close enough to intercept any threat, far enough not to trigger my flight response. "I blocked his number, Marcello," I replied, my tone tight, refusing to show the tremor in my hands. "I told him I'm not negotiating the terms of my surrender." Marcello's expression remained perfectly stoic, an unreadable mask of loyalty to his boss. He reached inside his overcoat. My pulse hammered violently against my throat, my mind calculating the distance to the nearest crowded intersection. But his hand emerged, not with a weapon, but with a long, slender object wrapped in heavy black silk ribbon. He extended his arm, offering it to me. It was a single dark-petaled rose, the black rose. I stared at it, the surreal nature of the object contrasting sharply with the bleak, concrete reality of the Queen's sidewalk. The petals were of velvet, impossibly deep crimson that bordered on true black. But what caught my breath wasn't the flower itself, it was the stem. Every single thorn had been carefully, meticulously shaved off, leaving the green stalk perfectly smooth. "Mr. Moretti requested I deliver this," Marcello stated, his tone completely devoid of inflection. I hesitated, my mind racing through the symbolism, the tactical meaning behind the gesture. A rose stripped of its thorns. It wasn't a threat, it was an acknowledgement. Dante was telling me he understood my fear of the cage. He was removing the weapons, presenting himself without the jagged edges that would make me bleed. "He's angry," I whispered, looking up from the rose to Marcello's impassive face. "Dante is rarely angry, Clara. He is focused," Marcello corrected smoothly. "And currently, his entire focus is on the fact that you are walking the streets of this city without a security detail. He sent me to ensure your transit to your sister's clinic is uncompromised. I don't need an escort." "With respect," Marcello replied, gesturing slightly to the armored door of the SUV. "The men who stole the capital from those ledgers know you found the discrepancy. They are currently hunting you. Get in the car." The truth of his words landed like a physical blow. The 3%, the weapons, the coup. I had pulled the pin on a grenade and walked away expecting the explosion to stay contained in the penthouse. I looked at the smooth stem of the black rose in Marcello's hand, then at the impenetrable safety of the vehicle. I reached out and took the flower. The petals felt like heavy silk against my numb fingers. I didn't get in the car, I couldn't yield that easily, not yet. "Tell him I got the message," I stated, my tone steadying. "But I have a sister to take care of, and I walk on my own 2 feet. Marcello didn't argue, he gave a single, curt nod, stepping back to allow me passage. But as I continued down the frozen sidewalk, the black armored SUV crept along the curb, trailing me at a crawling pace, a silent, rolling shadow, an imposing, heavily armed guardian angel keeping the wolves at bay. The fragile illusion of my independence shattered exactly 6 hours later. At 8 o'clock that evening, the freezing rain had evolved into a blinding snowstorm. I was carrying 2 plastic bags of groceries, the cheap handles biting into my frozen fingers as I approached the entrance to my apartment building. The streetlights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the brick facade. The alleyway next to my building was a narrow, pitch-black corridor. I never walked near it, but as I fumbled for my keys, the subtle crunch of snow behind me made my spine lock. It wasn't Marcello. Marcello moved silently. This was heavy, deliberate, and aggressively fast. "Miss Higgins." The voice was unfamiliar, raw, lacking the refined edge of Dante's men. I spun around, dropping the groceries. A man emerged from the alleyway. He wore a heavy parka, his face partially obscured by a dark scarf. but the street lamp caught the cold metallic gleam of the suppressed pistol in his right hand. A scout from the rival faction. They had found the leak. "Don't scream," the scout ordered, stepping closer, the gun raising him to level with my chest. "You have a flash drive. The boss wants to know exactly how much you've decrypted before we put you in the river." Panic, pure and blinding, exploded in my chest. My autonomy couldn't stop lead. Dante's warning echoed in my ears with terrifying clarity. I was a forensic accountant staring down the barrel of a cartel hitman's gun. Before the scout could take another step, a deafening roar shattered the quiet street. The armored black SUV vaulted over the curb, its high beams blindingly bright, flooding the alleyway in harsh white light. The heavy reinforced steel of the bumper slammed violently into the brick wall, mere inches from where the scout stood, crushing the nearby dumpster like paper. The scout stumbled back, raising his weapon toward the vehicle. The driver's door kicked open. Marcelo was out before the SUV even came to a complete stop. He didn't shout, he didn't hesitate. 3 silenced shots spit from his own weapon in a brutally rapid sequence. Chest, chest, head. The scout dropped to the snow, completely motionless. The sudden silence that followed was ringing, thick with the smell of cordite and exhaust. My knees gave out, hitting the icy pavement as I gasped for air, my heart threatening to crack my ribs. I stared at the dead man bleeding out into the white snow, the reality of the underworld violently colliding with my fragile existence. Marcelo holstered his weapon and moved toward me, his face grim. He reached down, gripping my upper arm and hauling me to my feet with terrifying ease. "The perimeter is compromised," Marcelo said, his voice flat, professional, masking the extreme violence that had just occurred. "We are leaving now." I didn't fight him this time, I couldn't. I let him drag me toward the idling SUV, the heavy passenger door swinging open to reveal the dark, leather-scented sanctuary inside. The ambient warmth of the vehicle blasted against my freezing skin. As I collapsed into the deep leather seat, my trembling hands brushed against something resting on the center console. The black rose. Marcelo slammed the door shut, locking me inside the armored vault, and climbed into the driver's seat. He threw the SUV into reverse, tearing off the curb and accelerating into the storm. I pulled my knees to my chest, shivering uncontrollably as the adrenaline violently exited my system. The cold reality of my situation was undeniable. I couldn't protect Elena on my own. I couldn't fight a syndicate war with spreadsheets and stubborn pride. I had to go back to the fortress. I had to go back to Dante. The drive back to Manhattan was a blur of flashing lights and Marcelo's hyper-evasive driving maneuvers. The city flew past the tinted, bulletproof glass, a world I was rapidly leaving behind. When the SUV finally descended into the subterranean parking garage of Dante's high-security high-rise, the heavy steel blast doors rolling shut behind us, a profound sense of inevitability settled over me. Marcelo killed the engine. The silence in the garage was absolute. "He's upstairs," Marcelo said quietly, not looking back at me. "He hasn't slept." I gripped the strap of my bag, where the Moretti ledger was safely tucked away, and picked up the thornless rose from the console. I exited the vehicle and walked toward the private elevator. The doors opened, recognizing the security chip in Marcelo's keys. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the penthouse. As the elevator began its rapid ascent, my breathing finally slowed. I was returning to the gilded cage, but the terms of my surrender had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't coming back as a frightened civilian seeking shelter. I was coming back as the architect of his enemy's ruin. Ours started with blood and thunder, and a woman stupid enough to open her door to danger. But some stories didn't have neat endings. Some involved living daily in spaces between right and wrong, justice and compromise, love and complications. When the doors chimed and slid open on the 60th floor, the suffocating, manufactured warmth of the penthouse wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. Dante was standing exactly where I had left him 24 hours ago, illuminated by the crackling fire, a dark, imposing king waiting for his queen to return from the cold. I emerged from the elevator, holding the black rose. He looked at me, his whiskey eyes locking onto mine, seeing the blood on the hem of my coat, seeing the unyielding determination in my spine. "I'm not negotiating the terms of my surrender," I declared, my words echoing clearly in the vast, soundproofed room. "I'm clarifying the job description." Dante didn't immediately respond. The silence in the penthouse was heavy, thick with the scent of burning cedar from the massive stone fireplace and the metallic, undeniable tang of adrenaline still clinging to my skin. He stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders blocking the amber light of the city below. The sheer physical dimensions of the man were designed to intimidate, to overwhelm, but I forced my spine to remain absolutely rigid. I held the black rose in my left hand, its thornless stem, a smooth, mocking reminder of his attempt to soften the edges of my captivity. My fingers were trembling, practically vibrating with the aftershocks of the evening's violence. But I gripped the flower tighter, using the pressure to ground myself. His whiskey eyes dropped from my face. He wasn't looking at my defiant posture. He was looking at the hem of my wool coat. I didn't have to look down to know what he saw. The dark, saturated stains of the rival scout's blood had soaked into the olive-green fabric when my knees had hit the snowy pavement. The visceral evidence of how close I had come to dying in that Queen's alleyway was screaming in the quiet room. The smell of copper was faint, but in the sterile, hyper-controlled environment of the penthouse, it might as well have been a siren. Dante moved. It wasn't a walk. It was a predatory glide across the polished marble floor. He closed the distance between us before I could take a defensive step backward. The ambient manufactured warmth of the room was instantly eclipsed by the raw, imposing heat radiating off his body. He stopped mere inches from me, his towering frame forcing me to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. I could see the minute pulse beating furiously at the base of his throat, a physical betrayal of the terrifying rage brewing just beneath his skin. He reached out, not for my throat, not for the rose, but for the hem of my coat. His long, calloused fingers brushed against the blood-stained wool. The touch was agonizingly slow, a tactile confirmation of the violence that had almost claimed me. When he looked back up at me, the control in his expression had fractured. The cold, untouchable mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man vibrating with a terrifying kinetic fury. "A job description," Dante repeated, the words rolling off his tongue like velvet wrapped around a switchblade. "You think this is a corporate negotiation, Clara? You think we are sitting in a boardroom debating profit margins? There is a dead man bleeding out into the snow 3 miles from your sister's apartment because he tried to put a bullet in your chest. Your life was measured in the split second it took Marcello to pull a trigger. And he pulled it," I countered, my voice remarkably clinical, a desperate attempt to employ my professional detachment against his overwhelming physical presence. "I accurately calculated the risk, and the protection you sent functioned perfectly. Because I survived, I retained the leverage. I found the corrupt officer orchestrating the coup. I found the missing variants in the shipping manifests. But I haven't decrypted the secondary accounts holding the stolen capital." I reached into my messenger bag, my fingers bypassing the cold metal of my laptop to find the matte black casing of the Moretti ledger. I pulled the encrypted USB drive out and held it up between us, a tiny piece of architecture containing the ruin of his enemies. "I have the routing numbers," I continued, forcing my breathing to remain shallow and steady. "I spent the last 48 hours cross-referencing shell corporations in the Caymans against your domestic trucking schedules. The discrepancy on the ledgers was small, a mere 3% variance in the shipping column, but to me it screamed like a siren in a silent room. I traced it all the way to the top, but the final layer of offshore encryption is locked behind a biometric algorithm I coded myself. I tied it to my pulse, Dante. You cannot open it without me. I am not handing this over and sitting quietly in a corner while you fight the war. If I am the target, I am going to be the architect of their destruction." Dante stared at the drive, then at my face. The muscles in his jaw locked so tightly, I thought I could hear the bone grind. He hated this. He hated that I had outmaneuvered his security. He hated that I had leveraged my intellect in a theater of violence. And he absolutely loathed that I was refusing to accept the passive safety of his gilded cage. "I will not let you sit at the war table," he growled, his tone sinking to a lethal velvet whisper that rattled my ribs. "The men hunting you do not care about your algorithms. They will rip you apart to plug the leak. You are going to stay in this penthouse. You are going to let my men guard the perimeter, and you are going to give me the decryption key. That is not a negotiation." "Then you don't get the data," I said flatly. The air between us snapped. Dante stepped fully into my space, his chest brushing against my coat. His hand came up, gripping my upper arm. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. An immovable, dominant force reminding me exactly who I was dealing with. My pulse hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my throat. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to yield, to let the Alpha Protector take the burden. I had been invisible my entire professional life, a ghost in the spreadsheets, fighting crushing medical debts for Elena alone. To just hand over the Moretti ledger. To let him burn the city down while I slept in silk sheets. The temptation to collapse into his strength was a siren song. But giving up my autonomy meant giving up the only thing that made me valuable. I couldn't be just a kept woman, another fragile thing stored away for safekeeping. I had to be a sovereign partner. If we were going to survive this, he had to respect my mind as much as he wanted to guard my body. "Do not push me tonight, Clara," Dante whispered, his breath fanning hot across my cheek, carrying the faint scent of expensive scotch and raw adrenaline. His eyes were entirely black in the dim light, devoid of their usual whiskey warmth. I am standing on a razor's edge. I watched the security footage of that alleyway from the car. I watched a weapon level at your heart. My tolerance for your independence is currently non-existent. My independence is what found the leak in your empire. I shot back, my defensive walls rising higher, my voice refusing to break. I am not a pet. I will not be locked in a vault while you decide my fate. I am the one who uncovered the betrayal, and I will see it finished. Dante's chest heaved. He stared down at me for 5 agonizing seconds, processing the sheer, stubborn magnitude of my refusal. He realized that if he stayed in this room, he would break my boundaries by force. He would take the drive from my fingers, lock the reinforced steel doors, and strip away the intellectual dignity I had fought so desperately to build. And he knew that if he did that, he would lose my trust forever. The fragile connection we had forged in the dark would shatter, irreparable and lost. He released my arm abruptly, stepping back as if the contact burned him. "Fine," Dante spat, his voice laced with a dark, bitter resignation. He turned his back to me, striding purposefully toward the private elevator. "Keep your algorithm, but you are not leaving this floor. I am locking the penthouse down. No one enters. No one leaves. If you want to play a dangerous game, Clara, you can start by surviving the isolation of the fortress." He stepped into the elevator. He didn't look back at me as the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing me inside. The silence that rushed into the room was deafening. The sheer adrenaline of the confrontation evaporated instantly, leaving my knees weak and my hands trembling violently. I dropped my messenger bag onto the polished marble floor and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window. Outside, the blizzard was reaching its peak, the snow swirling in chaotic, blinding fixes across the Manhattan skyline. The biting cold of the glass seeped through the thick panes, but inside, the air was heavy, warm and entirely empty. I was completely alone. He had given me exactly what I asked for. My autonomy, the preservation of my boundaries, and yet, the emptiness of the 60-floor high-rise felt like a physical weight pressing against my lungs. I shrugged off my blood-stained coat, letting it fall onto a beige velvet armchair. Underneath, I was still wearing the same cheap, olive-green blouse I had put on at dawn. It felt absurd in this multi-million-dollar space. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I had to use both thumbs to unlock the screen. I immediately checked the digital deadman switch I had programmed hours ago. The offshore cloud server was stable. The backup files were secure. If Dante's enemies managed to breach this building, the federal agencies would receive the data dump within 60 seconds of my pulse stopping. I had built the ultimate insurance policy. But the tactical security didn't soothe the burning frustration in my chest. Dante had stormed out. He expected me to sit in this luxurious, perfectly temperature-controlled vacuum and simply wait until his temper cooled. He thought isolation would break my resolve, that the sheer terror of what I had survived in Queens would eventually make me beg for his presence. I opened my contacts list. I stared at the screen, my breathing shallow. I had already blocked his standard phone number at 7 o'clock this morning, severing the mundane line of communication after ignoring 12 missed calls, and that single, final text command telling me to return. But now I scrolled down to the other entry. The private, highly encrypted satellite number his team had installed on my device, meant to be used exclusively for life-or-death emergencies. My thumb hovered over the screen. It was a petty, desperate, entirely necessary assertion of my remaining control. I pressed block caller. The confirmation prompt vanished. I didn't stop there. I opened the secure military-grade messaging application his tech team had forced onto my device. I navigated to his administrator profile, revoked his tracking access, and blocked the account. Finally, in a surge of cold, methodical anger, I opened the public-facing social media applications. I searched for the polished, corporate profiles of the Moretti enterprise. the fake, legitimate front of his underworld empire, and blocked every single one of them. I severed the digital tether completely. If the head of the Moretti syndicate wanted to communicate with me, he wasn't going to do it through commands on a screen. He wasn't going to track my vitals through a smartwatch or monitor my network traffic. He was going to have to walk back through those elevator doors and face me as an equal. I walked into the massive chef's kitchen, the cold marble soothing the soles of my feet. I needed to do something normal, something grounded, to keep the memories of the alleyway at bay. I found the espresso machine, a gleaming, chrome monstrosity that probably cost more than my entire apartment, and began the mechanical process of pulling a shot. Grind the beans, tamp the grounds, steam the milk. The hiss and sputter of the machine were the only sounds in the sprawling penthouse. I drank the espresso standing by the island, watching the snow fall over a city that felt entirely removed from my reality. I had drawn my line in the sand. Now I just had to wait and see if the monster in the dark would respect it. Dante exited the private elevator into the sub-basement command center of his enterprise. The transition from the warm, wood-paneled penthouse to the brutalist concrete and humming server racks of the tactical floor mirrored the violent shift in his own psyche. The air down here smelled of ozone, overheated electronics, and the sharp metallic tang of gun oil. It was a space built for war, far removed from the civilian luxury above. The command center was a hive of controlled chaos. 10 heavily armed operatives sat behind banks of glowing monitors, tracking the digital and physical movements of the city's underworld grid. When Dante entered the room, the low murmur of tactical chatter ceased instantly. The silence was absolute, born of a deep ingrained terror of the man who ruled them. Marcello was standing near a stainless steel utility sink in the corner, his dark overcoat discarded over a chair. He was methodically washing the faint, almost imperceptible splatter of the rival scout's blood from his knuckles. He didn't turn around as Dante approached the central mahogany tactical desk, but his posture stiffened, recognizing the lethal, uncoiled tension radiating from his boss. Dante slammed his hands flat against the polished wood of the desk, leaning his weight forward. The image of Clara, pale, shivering, clutching that absurd thornless rose while her coat bore the blood of an assassin, was burning a permanent hole in his prefrontal cortex. His protective instincts, usually a tightly leashed weapon, were currently a wild, uncontrollable inferno. He had wanted to lock her in his bedroom, assign a dozen men to her door, and tear the city apart until there was no one left to threaten her. But she had looked him in the eye and demanded sovereignty. "Report," Dante commanded, his voice deadly quiet, echoing off the concrete walls. Marcello dried his hands on a towel and turned, his expression carefully neutral, the perfect enforcer. "The cleanup crew processed the alleyway in Queens. The scout's body has been disposed of. No witnesses, no police chatter. He was carrying a suppressed 9mm and a burner phone. The last dialed number traced back to a relay tower in the Southern District." "How close did he get to her?" Dante asked, his whiskey eyes locking onto Marcello's. He needed the exact physical metrics of his failure. 6 feet, Marcello answered with clinical precision, unflinching under the deadly stare. He had the weapon leveled. If she hadn't paused to drop her grocery bags, the angle of his approach would have been fatal before I could intervene and take the shot. Dante's vision edged with static black. 6 feet. The very man leading his own shipping company had bypassed his counter-surveillance and put a gun 6 feet from Clara's chest. The realization that the leak was not just a financial hemorrhage, but a direct, aggressive threat to her life, made his blood run freezing cold. She had been invisible for months, meticulously decoding the Moretti ledger, and the moment she stepped out into the open, they had nearly killed her. "Purge the upper management," Dante ordered, his tone devoid of any human empathy. "I want the traitorous executive brought to the warehouse in Brooklyn. Empty his accounts, seize his assets, and detain anyone he spoke to in the last 48 hours. I am going to tear this coup out by the roots. No one sleeps until the domestic shipping routes are completely locked down." The operatives at the monitors immediately began typing, the clatter of keyboards filling the silence. Despite the tactical commands leaving his mouth, Dante's internal focus remained entirely tethered to the 60th floor. He had walked out of the penthouse to prevent himself from breaking her boundaries by force. He knew Clara's hypervigilance. She was a woman who had survived by treating every relationship as a transactional risk. She had spent years bearing the crushing weight of her sister Elena's medical bills, fighting off a world that tried to crush her. She wasn't asking for his black card. She wasn't raiding his accounts for a payout. She was demanding his absolute surrender to a partnership he deemed too dangerous for her to handle. He needed to assert his presence. He needed to remind her that even though he had given her the physical space she demanded, the umbrella of his protection had not wavered. His somatic hypervigilance demanded he verify her status, to ensure she was settling down and not spiraling into a panic attack alone in the dark. Dante reached into the breast pocket of his bespoke suit and pulled out his custom-encrypted smartphone. He bypassed the complex biometric security and opened the secure communication channel he had personally installed on her device. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the digital keyboard. He needed to issue a command that would ground her, something mundane to anchor her back to reality. Eat something. The chef left a plate in the warming drawer. Do not sit by the window. He pressed send. Screen buffered for a fraction of a second. Then, a harsh, glowing red exclamation point appeared next to the text bubble. Message failed. User has restricted access. Dante frowned, a deep, dark line forming between his brows. The network in the building was flawless, running on an independent satellite link. He tapped the screen, attempting to resend the encrypted data packet. The same red error flashed aggressively. His jaw tightened. He exited the application and switched to the standard cellular network. He dialed her private number, the one he paid for, the one routed through 3 untraceable offshore servers. The line didn't even ring. It clicked immediately to the sterile, automated voice of the carrier. The number you are trying to reach is unavailable at this time. She had blocked him. Again. She had blocked his standard number this morning, and now she had systematically dismantled every fail-safe he had placed on her device. Disbelief warred with a sudden surging wave of absolute fury. Dante lowered the phone slowly. He opened the corporate social media monitor, a habit he used to quietly track her digital footprint when she was just a freelance auditor investigating his lower-level accounts. He searched for the connection between her professional profile and his corporate fronts. It was gone. The connection had been severed. She had systematically, ruthlessly purged him from every digital avenue of her existence. While sitting in his own penthouse, eating his food, protected by a perimeter of his deadliest men, she had locked him out. She had taken the digital leash and cut it clean through. The snap of his temper was sudden and violently physical. Dante's hand closed around the heavy, crystal tumbler of whiskey that one of his lieutenants had placed on the corner of the desk minutes earlier. His grip tightened with crushing force. The thick crystal shattered. Amber liquid and razor-sharp shards of glass exploded across the mahogany tactical desk, scattering over the glowing tablets and printed maps of the city grid. The sound was like a gunshot in the enclosed concrete room. Absolute silence crashed over the command center. 10 heavily armed operatives froze mid-keystroke, the blood draining from their faces. No one breathed. They stared at their boss, terrified by the sudden, unprecedented crack in his legendary armor. Dante Moretti did not lose his temper over corporate spreadsheets. He did not shatter glass over cartel threats. He operated with lethal, silent precision. Marcello stepped forward, his eyes dropping to the blood welling in the palm of Dante's hand, mixing with the spilled whiskey and catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Boss, she blocked me." Dante breathed the words a lethal, disbelieving whisper to the empty room. He ignored the blood dripping from his hand onto the pristine floor. The sharp sting of the glass biting into his flesh was entirely irrelevant. What consumed him was the staggering realization that Clara Higgins was the one variable in his empire he could not conquer with force, money, or intimidation. She had taken the ultimate symbol of his power, the total isolation of his penthouse, and turned it into a weapon against him. She was demanding respect, and she was willing to sit in absolute darkness to get it. Dante pulled a dark silk handkerchief from his pocket, wrapping it tightly around his bleeding palm. His whiskey eyes lifted, locking onto the bank of security monitors displaying the feed from the 60th floor. On the screen, Clara was standing in the kitchen, her delicate hands wrapped around a porcelain espresso cup. She looked exhausted. Her shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of the trauma she had just survived, but her chin was held high. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a brilliant, defiant queen demanding her crown, and she was forcing the king to his knees to deliver it. "Cancel my meetings for the next 48 hours. Dante ordered, his voice returning to a cold, calculated cadence that was infinitely more dangerous than the shattered glass. No one contacts the penthouse. Let her sit in the silence. We will see exactly how long her autonomy lasts when the ghosts start whispering in the dark. And Marcelo? Yes, boss. Prepare the SUV. Dante said, his eyes never leaving the monitor. If she wants to be a sovereign partner, she is going to watch me burn her enemies to ash. We are bringing her to the warehouse. I had been isolated in the atmospheric vacuum of the 60th floor for exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes. The silence in the sprawling Manhattan penthouse was not merely the absence of noise. It was a heavy, engineered physical entity. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, the blizzard continued its brutal assault on the city, the sleet slashing in horizontal sheets against the panes. Yet, inside this multi-million-dollar fortress, the climate control maintained a relentless, suffocating 72 degrees. My skin, still raw and wind-chapped from the freezing rain in Queens, protested violently against the sudden dry heat. The extreme thermal shift made my cheeks flush, a phantom burn that tightened the pores and left a faint, stinging itch across my jawline, as if the frostbite had been baked directly into my epidermis. I could feel my lungs, still tight from gasping sub-zero air during the street-level ambush, fighting to expand in this perfectly filtered, ozone-heavy atmosphere. The air smelled of expensive polished wood, the lingering ghost of burning cedar from the dying fire, and the faint, sterile scent of localized air purifiers. It was a gilded cage designed to pacify, but my somatic hypervigilance was currently operating at a deafening frequency. I sat cross-legged on the center of the massive ivory velvet sofa in the main living area, the matte black casing of my laptop burning a dull heat into my thighs. My muscles were screaming, stiff and locked with the toxic residue of an adrenaline crash. The dull, throbbing ache in my patella was a harsh, physical reminder of hitting the icy pavement in Queens, right before a rival scout's bullet was supposed to end my life. If Marcelo hadn't pulled his trigger a split second faster, painting the brick wall with the scout's blood, I wouldn't be sitting here. I had washed my face in the sprawling, dark marble cathedral of a bathroom down the hall, scrubbing the freezing water over my skin until it turned raw, desperately trying to eliminate the phantom scent of cordite and the metallic copper of blood. It hadn't worked. The violent reality of the underworld clung to me like a second skin, settling back onto my shoulders like a familiar, suffocating blanket. I forced my eyes away from the dark windows and audited the room. My professional survival had always depended on meticulous observation, on finding the microscopic flaws in massive systems. I applied that same clinical calculation to my current prison. There were 7 visible security cameras, 4 smoked glass dome lenses positioned in the architectural recesses of the ceiling corners, 2 pinhole sensors integrated into the brushed steel paneling near the private elevator, and 1 high-resolution panoramic lens mounted directly above the chef's kitchen island. I knew there were more hidden within the HVAC vents and the lighting fixtures. I could feel them. The invisible lasers mapping the perimeter, the acoustic sensors calibrated to register the slightest shift in breathing patterns. Dante did not build sanctuaries. He built impenetrable bunkers disguised as high-end architecture. The sensation of being watched was a persistent, paranoid prickle at the base of my neck. I had blocked his standard phone number. I had revoked his administrative tracking access on my secure devices. I had systematically severed every digital tether connecting me to the head of the Moretti Syndicate, demanding my autonomy in the face of his terrifying, possessive authority. But sitting here in the quiet isolation of the night, under the unblinking red LED lights of his internal surveillance grid, the illusion of my independence felt painfully thin. He wasn't calling. He wasn't kicking the heavy steel doors open to demand my submission. He was simply letting me drown in the absolute, crushing weight of his omnipresence. I pulled my attention back to the glowing blue screen of my laptop. I needed to establish a routine, some semblance of my normal, grueling day-to-day existence, to anchor my fraying nerves. I had spent the last 48 hours decoding the heavily encrypted files within the Moretti ledger, meticulously tracking the digital breadcrumbs left by an executive vice president, who thought he was smarter than Dante himself. The minor numerical flaw in the shipping logs was small, a slight fractional inconsistency in the shipping logistics column. But to a forensic accountant trained to spot the invisible, it screamed like a siren in a silent room. I had mapped the diverted funds through 6 different offshore shell corporations, untangling the sophisticated web of fake invoices and ghost payrolls before confirming the existence of a high-level mole within Dante's inner circle. To guarantee my own survival, I had already established a digital dead man switch, a secure offshore cloud backup of the decrypted ledger data, programmed to automatically release files to federal agencies and rival syndicates if I disappeared. He knew it. I knew he knew it. It was the only reason we were playing this high-stakes game of psychological chess, instead of a hostile interrogation. The code was my armor. My intellect was the only currency that carried weight in his brutal world. I opened secure, encrypted browser, and bypassed the local network's firewalls, tunneling my connection through a proxy server in Switzerland before logging into the patient portal for St. Mary's Hospital. The screen loaded slowly. Elena's medical chart materialized, a dense grid of pulmonary function tests, oxygen saturation levels, and the terrifying, ever-mounting column of outstanding balances. I save children for a living, which pays enough to survive, but never enough to quiet the worry. That was the reality I had inhabited before a tiny structural flaw in a corporate ledger dragged me into a cartel war. I stared at a newly posted invoice for her respiratory therapy. $420. A drop in the ocean compared to the millions bleeding through the offshore accounts I had decrypted, but to me, it was a tangible, immediate crisis. The flashing red digits were a stark reminder of the fragile thread holding my sister's life together. The sound of her struggling for breath echoed in my memory, a phantom wheeze that tightened my own chest. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I transferred the funds from my dwindling freelance checking account, paying the invoice in full. The digital receipt popped up, offering a pathetic, fleeting rush of dopamine. I was still providing. I was still keeping her breathing. But as I closed the portal, the vast emptiness of the penthouse rushed back in to fill the void. I stood up, the joints in my knees popping loudly in the quiet room. The olive green blouse I wore felt cheap and abrasive against my skin, completely incongruous with the Macassar ebony paneling and the silk blend rugs beneath my bare feet. My blood-stained winter coat was still draped over the back of an armchair, a ruined artifact of my civilian life. I walked slowly toward the kitchen island, the cold marble surface soothing the lingering heat in my soles. Resting in the exact center of the vast counter was the object Marcelo had handed me on the street. The black rose. I reached out, my trembling fingertips hovering over the impossibly deep crimson velvet of the petals. A single dark-petaled rose with its thorns carefully shaved off, tied with a heavy black silk ribbon. A silent signature of Dante's absolute possession. It was a tactical message delivered through botany, a chilling promise that he understood my fear of his jagged edges. But he was claiming me anyway. I picked it up, feeling the heavy, expensive silk wrap around the base. The sheer arrogance of Dante, to send a symbol of dark romance while his enforcers were dropping bodies in the snow to keep me breathing. The stem was smooth against my palm, a tactile reminder of the meticulous violence he was capable of. He had removed the thorn so I wouldn't bleed, but the flower itself was a warning. I turned slowly, holding the flower, and looked directly up at the panoramic camera lens mounted above the refrigerator. I didn't wave. I didn't speak. I simply stared into the dark glass, my chin tilted up in a silent challenge, letting the person I knew was watching from the subterranean depths of the building see that I was not breaking. I was not pacing like a trapped animal. I was standing in the center of his fortress, holding the concession he had sent me, refusing to yield an inch of my intellectual dignity. I held the gaze for a full 60 seconds. The red LD light on the camera blinked steadily, an erratic heartbeat in the synthetic silence. Finally, the exhaustion seeped deep into my bones, a heavy gravitational pull that made my eyelids flutter. I turned away from the lens, set the rose gently back onto the marble, and walked back to the sofa. I refused to sleep in the master suite down the hall. Claiming his bed felt like a surrender I wasn't prepared to make. Instead, I pulled a thick cashmere throw blanket from the back of the couch, wrapped it tightly around my shivering shoulders, and curled into a tight, defensive ball facing the elevator doors. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the ventilation, waiting for the digital walls I had built to inevitably shatter. 60 floors below the freezing winds of the Manhattan skyline, the sub-basement command center operated in a state of lethal, hyper-focused efficiency. The air in the tactical bunker was thick with the mechanical hum of towering server racks, the smell of dark roast espresso, and the sharp, coppery scent of the blood, slowly soaking through the dark silk handkerchief wrapped around Dante's right hand. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the bunker, a towering silhouette of bespoke charcoal wool and predatory tension. His whiskey eyes were locked onto the primary security monitor mounted on the concrete wall. On the high-definition screen, the forensic accountant was staring directly back at him. She looked small in the vast, cavernous space of the penthouse kitchen, wrapped in a cheap blouse that offered zero protection against the psychological pressure he was applying. But her spine was forged from titanium. He watched the way her delicate fingers gripped the smooth stem of the rose. He watched the absolute, unyielding defiance in her pale face as she stared into the camera lens, looking through the fiber optic cables and directly into his soul. She wasn't begging for release. She was holding the line. "She is auditing the cage," Dante murmured, his words a dark, rumbling vibration that barely carried over the sound of the cooling fans. Marcello stood 2 paces behind him, his posture reflecting the rigid discipline of an enforcer who knew exactly how dangerous his employer was in this current state of forced restraint. "The perimeter is entirely secure, boss. The elevators are locked down. No one can access the upper floors without your biometric override. My operatives have established a 3-block exclusion zone around the building. The rival scout who tried to touch her has been disposed of. His associates will not attempt another breach tonight. Physical security is irrelevant if she believes she has successfully isolated herself from me," Dante replied, his tone chillingly flat. He slowly flexed his injured hand, feeling the sharp sting of the microscopic glass shards, shifting beneath the silk binding. The physical pain was a welcome distraction, a harsh, jagged reminder of the moment she had walked out, when his ruthless authority had collided with her fierce independence, and his rage had shattered the heavy crystal whiskey glass, barehanded in the penthouse office. The memory of their argument still hung in the air between them, a brutal collision of his uncompromising dominion and her desperate need for self-preservation. But Clara was not a woman who could be conquered by brute force. She had spent a lifetime dragging her sister out of poverty, relying solely on her brilliant, analytical mind to survive a world that constantly tried to grind her into dust. When he had demanded her complete surrender, she had accurately identified the threat to her autonomy and built a digital fortress to keep him out. She had blocked his phone. She had revoked his tracking software. She was demanding that he respect her intellect as a sovereign partner, not just a liability to be guarded in a gilded tower. If he broke the door down now, he would prove every one of her defensive fears correct. He needed to dismantle her barricades with the same surgical precision she used to dissect his financial ledgers. "She thinks a digital block stops me," Dante said, a dark, dangerous fraction of a smile touching the corner of his mouth. It was a predator's smile, recognizing the intelligence of his prey and adjusting the hunt accordingly. "She thinks she can sever the tether simply by refusing to answer the phone." He turned away from the monitor, his heavy leather shoes striking the polished concrete floor, with deliberate, measured steps as he approached the central mahogany tactical desk. He bypassed the logistical maps of the Brooklyn shipping yards, where his enforcers were currently dismantling the executive vice president's coup. The cartel war was a secondary concern. The traitor who had embezzled 3% of the syndicate's logistics revenue would bleed before dawn. But the primary objective was the fiercely independent woman upstairs, who held the decryption keys to his empire, and the only keys to his humanity. "Marcello," Dante commanded, his voice shifting into the absolute, unquestionable authority of Dante Moretti. "Access the smart home mainframe for the penthouse. I want a direct interface with the environmental controls." The driver stepped forward instantly, sliding into the leather chair in front of the primary engineering terminal. His fingers moved rapidly across the illuminated keyboard, bringing up the complex, classified schematics of the building's internal architecture. "Mainframe accessed, boss. I have complete control over the local subnet, HVAC, lighting, automated blinds, and the internal audio-visual grid." Dante stepped up behind the chair, his dark eyes scanning the cascading lines of code. He was going to execute a silent intervention. He was going to strip away the illusion of her isolation without ever speaking a word, proving that his protection and his possession were woven into the very fabric of the environment she occupied. "Drop the ambient temperature in the main living area by exactly 2 degrees, Dante instructed smoothly, Let her feel the shift. Marcello executed the command. Now Dante continued, his gaze returning to the live video feed. He watched as Clara, curled on the sofa under the cashmere throw, visibly shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around her throat as the subtle chill flooded the room. Isolate the audio system in the living room. Pipe in the vinyl recording of a winter string concerto from my private server. Keep the volume at a whisper, just enough to break the vacuum. The enforcer's fingers flew across the keys. A second later, the waveform on the audio monitor spiked slightly. On the screen, Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide as the haunting, methodical strings of the classical piece began to echo through the silence of her cage. She knew instantly that the music was not an automated preset. It was a curated, deliberate touch, a phantom caress designed to bypass her logic. She's entirely reliant on that laptop for her sense of leverage, Dante noted, watching her grip the matte black machine resting on the sofa cushion next to her. The Moretti ledger was still tucked safely in her bag on the floor, but the computer was her weapon. It was the terminal linking her to the offshore system. Override her local area network, bypass the encrypted tunnel she built. I want control of every digital screen on that floor. Marcello paused for a brief moment, recognizing the sheer aggressive dominance of the move, initiating systemic override, pushing through her firewalls now. Dante leaned his weight onto his uninjured left hand, his eyes burning with a dark, calculated intensity as he watched the monitor. He was about to tear down the walls she had spent the last 4 hours fortifying. He was going to prove that her isolation was a fallacy. When you breach the screens, Dante ordered, his words sinking to a lethal velvet resonance. Cut the power to the primary lighting grid. Black out the penthouse. Leave only the monitors illuminated. And display a direct broadcast text on every single interface. What is the message, boss? Dante stared at the woman on the screen, seeing the exact moment her brilliant mind realized she was completely surrounded. Tell her exactly what she needs to hear, Dante said. Upstairs, the haunting, low decibel resonance of the classical violins was crawling under my skin. I had jolted upright the moment the music began, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The sudden 2-degree drop in temperature had been a subtle, physical warning, but the music was a direct, psychological invasion. It was a terrifyingly sophisticated demonstration of power. He wasn't kicking down the door. He was manipulating the atmosphere of my reality, proving that even though I had blocked his phone, he owned the grid I was breathing in. I reached for my laptop, desperate to run a diagnostic on the local network, to find the back door he was exploiting and shut it down. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. Before I could execute a single keystroke, the matte black casing beneath my palms grew violently hot. The internal cooling fan suddenly shrieked, a high-pitched, desperate mechanical whine, fighting a massive instantaneous processor spike as a foreign entity ripped through my encrypted firewalls. Then, the screen violently glitched. The complex spreadsheet of offshore routing numbers vanished. The secure, encrypted browser I had built collapsed instantly, replaced by a solid, impenetrable wall of deep, absolute black. I gasped, recoiling from the machine as if it had physically burned me. Simultaneously, a heavy metallic clunk echoed through the vast architecture of the penthouse. The recessed amber lighting in the ceiling died completely. The subtle under-cabinet illumination in the kitchen snapped off. The entire 60-floor fortress plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness broken only by the chaotic, swirling gray light of the blizzard raging outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. My breath caught in my throat. I sat frozen on the velvet sofa, clutching the cashmere blanket to my chest, my hypervigilance spiking into pure, unadulterated terror. The silence beneath the whispering violins was heavy and predatory. Then, the screens woke up. It wasn't just my laptop. The massive 80-inch smart television mounted on the far wall flared to life. The digital control panels embedded in the marble pillars illuminated. The smart refrigerator interface in the kitchen glowed. Every single digital surface in the sprawling multi-million-dollar space activated simultaneously, casting a cold, synchronized white glare across the pitch-black room. There were no graphics, no operating systems. Just a solid black background on every screen, displaying a single line of crisp, white text. Your digital walls are an illusion, Clara. I stared at the glowing letters on my laptop screen, my lungs refusing to expand. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of his reach was staggering. He had bypassed military-grade encryption without breaking a sweat, simply to remind me that my autonomy existed only because he allowed it. It was a terrifying absolute assertion of dominance, executed with a clinical precision that matched my own analytical mind. He had breached my automated failsafe network just to send a text message. A violent tremor started in my wrists, radiating up into my chest, until my throat tightened into a painful breathless knot, my fingernails digging so hard into the velvet cushions that my knuckles ached. I didn't have time to process the shock before the text on the screens vanished, instantly replaced by a second, final command. Bring the ledger. Come to the elevator. The violins of the concerto faded into silence. The screens abruptly cut to black, returning the penthouse to complete darkness. A second later, a soft electronic chime echoed from the foyer. The heavy, steel-reinforced doors of the private elevator slid open, the warm amber light of the cab spilling out across the polished marble floor like a pathway cut through the void. I sat in the dark for a long, agonizing moment, the ambient glow of the city storm casting faint, moving shadows across my face. My pride demanded that I stay on the sofa, that I refuse the summons and force him to come up here and drag me out into the light. But the brilliant, calculating forensic accountant inside my head recognized the tactical reality of the situation. He had shattered my defenses without touching me. He had proven his point. The silent intervention was over, and the cartel war was still waiting outside. He had spared my sister Elena, paid off my debts, and eliminated the rival scout on the street without asking for a thank you. He was offering a partnership, but I had to be brave enough to step into the fire. If I wanted to be a sovereign partner, I couldn't hide in the dark. I had to step onto the battlefield. I threw the cashmere blanket off my shoulders and stood up. The cold air bit through my thin olive green blouse, but I ignored the shivering. I walked over to the velvet armchair and grabbed my ruined coat, immediately abandoning it when my fingers brushed the crust of dried blood. I couldn't wear that. I moved swiftly toward the hall closet, my bare feet silent on the floorboards, and pulled out a heavy, tailored cashmere overcoat that smelled intoxicatingly of cedar and expensive leather. I slid it on. It swallowed my frame entirely, the heavy hem brushing my calves, but the residual warmth woven into the fabric instantly steadied my shaking hands. It felt like an embrace, a heavy, armored shield against the freezing night. I walked over to the kitchen island, bypassing the espresso machine, and grabbed my leather messenger bag containing the Moretti ledger. I unzipped the main compartment, my fingers sliding past my wallet until they brushed against the cold, heavy metal casing of the encrypted USB drive. I ran my thumb over its ridged edge, a tactile confirmation of my leverage, my digital armor, before letting it drop safely back to the bottom of the bag. As I turned toward the waiting elevator, my eyes caught the silhouette of the black rose resting on the marble counter, a dark concession. I reached out, snatched the smooth, thornless stem, and walked purposefully into the amber light of the elevator cab. The steel doors slid shut silently, sealing me inside as the machinery engaged, pulling me down into the subterranean depths of his empire to watch him burn my enemies to ash. The rapid, stomach-dropping descent of the private elevator felt entirely different this time. When I had ridden it down to the ground floor hours earlier, fleeing the suffocating warmth of the penthouse after our explosive argument, I had been a terrified civilian clutching a stolen USB drive, desperate to reclaim my independence. Now, as the steel cab plunged toward the sub-basement command center, I was not running away. I was descending directly into the nerve center of the Moretti syndicate, wrapped in the heavy, intoxicating armor of Dante's tailored cashmere overcoat. The fabric swallowed my frame, the hem brushing against my calves, but it provided a profound somatic grounding. It smelled of freezing night air, expensive Italian leather, and the dark, smoky cedar that clung to his skin, a sensory cocktail that systematically dismantled the lingering adrenaline tremors in my wrists. I wasn't just wearing his coat. I was wearing his absolute authority. I stood perfectly still under the amber halogen lighting of the cab. In my right hand, I gripped the leather strap of my messenger bag, feeling the solid, metallic weight of the Moretti ledger resting safely at the bottom. In my left hand, I held the smooth, thornless stem of the single black rose he had sent with Marcello at 2:14 p.m. I traced my thumb over the impossibly dark velvet of the petals, analyzing the tactical reality of my situation with cold forensic logic. I had attempted to build a digital fortress this morning. At exactly 7 a.m., I had blocked his cellular number. I had ignored 12 missed calls. I had deleted his final text command. I had revoked his administrative tracking access and severed every virtual tether connecting my fragile, impoverished existence to his violent empire. In response, Dante had not shouted. He had not broken down my physical doors in Queens. He had simply bypassed my military-grade firewalls, hijacked the environmental controls of the penthouse, and plunged my immediate environment into absolute darkness to prove a singular terrifying point. My autonomy existed solely because he permitted it. The elevator decelerated with a heavy, mechanical groan. The numbers above the door flashed, counting down to a subterranean level that didn't exist on any public blueprint of the Manhattan high-rise. The steel doors slid apart, instantly exposing me to a violent shift in atmospheric pressure. The air in the tactical bunker was entirely devoid of the curated, silent luxury of the 60th floor. It smelled of overheated server racks, dark roast espresso, and the sharp metallic tang of gun oil. The space was a brutalist cathedral of exposed concrete, matte black steel, and reinforced glass, a hidden fortress designed exclusively for the orchestration of war. 10 heavily armed operatives sat at a curved bank of glowing high-definition monitors, tracking the digital and physical movements of the city's underworld grid. The low, rapid murmur of tactical chatter ceased the exact second the elevator chimed. I left the cab. My bare feet met the freezing, polished concrete floor, a harsh, grounding contrast to the residual warmth of the overcoat draped across my shoulders. Every eye in the room flicked toward me, calculating my presence, but I ignored the enforcers. My analytical focus locked entirely onto the man standing at the center of the room. Dante Moretti was leaning forward over a massive mahogany tactical desk, a towering silhouette of bespoke charcoal wool and sheer, predatory tension. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the bunker cast sharp shadows across the unforgiving angles of his jaw, highlighting the exhaustion and absolute ruthlessness etched into his features. He didn't look up from the sprawling logistical maps immediately, but the sudden, rigid stillness of his broad shoulders told me he had tracked my approach from the exact moment my pulse entered the room. When he finally lifted his head, his whiskey eyes locked onto mine. The sheer physical dimensions of his authority were designed to overwhelm, to force submission through raw presence alone, but I refused to let my hyper-vigilance win. I kept my chin elevated. I walked slowly across the concrete floor, refusing to break eye contact, closing the distance until only the edge of the mahogany desk separated us. I placed the single black rose onto the polished wood. The crimson petals looked surreal, almost excessively delicate, against the harsh, illuminated tactical schematics of the city. I clarified the job description, I stated, my tone remarkably steady, echoing clearly in the dead silence of the command center. I wasn't shaking anymore. I am not a liability to be locked in a gilded cage while you fight a war that I uncovered. The minor numerical flaw in your shipping logs was my discovery. The biometric encryption protecting the offshore routing numbers is my architecture. The digital dead man's switch, I programmed, is the only thing keeping your internal enemies from liquidating your assets. If you want the traitor who orchestrated this coup to burn, we burn him together, as partners, not as a guardian and a hostage. Dante stared at the rose, then slowly dragged his gaze up to my face. The dark, calculated intensity in his eyes was terrifying. Yet beneath the lethal exterior of the syndicate boss, I could see the distinct, agonizing restraint of a man who was fighting every ingrained instinct to simply drag me across the desk, pull me into his arms, and lock the world away. His right hand was resting heavily on the desk, tightly wrapped in a dark silk handkerchief. A fresh, brilliant stain of crimson was slowly blooming through the expensive fabric, the coppery scent of his blood mixing with the ozone of the server room. My forensic brain instantly calculated the injury. He had shattered something heavy and sharp, likely a crystal decanter or a glass panel, with his bare hands. An explosion of raw fury triggered the moment he realized I had blocked his digital access and attempted to walk out of his protection. Your intellect is not in question, Clara, Dante murmured, his deep register, a rumbling vibration that bypassed my ears and rattled deep in my sternum. He didn't raise his tone, but the absolute, unquestionable dominance in his cadence commanded the gravity of the entire room. Every operative in the bunker was holding their breath. But your perception of risk is fundamentally flawed. You believe that blocking my access creates a boundary. You believe that holding a decrypted ledger makes you an equal combatant on the street. It does not. It makes you the primary target for men who do not negotiate, men who do not possess my restraint. I survived the alleyway, I countered, my fingernails digging instinctively into the thick leather strap of my bag. I survived the cartel scout outside my apartment because I calculated the risk. I am not helpless. You survived because Marcelo put 3 bullets in his chest before he could pull the trigger, Dante corrected coldly, his uninjured left hand reaching out. He didn't touch the rose. He didn't demand the ledger. He simply pointed his long, elegant finger toward a reinforced, frosted glass door situated at the far end of the tactical bunker. Before we dismantle the logistics firm, you need to verify your primary asset. You demanded sovereignty. You demanded that I respect your forensic logic over my instinct to cage you. I am respecting it. But to do that, I secured the only variable in your life that could be used as leverage against you. My heart stalled. The rhythmic, pounding cadence of my pulse missed a crucial beat, leaving a cold, breathless vacuum in my chest. A sickening wave of terror washed over me, chilling the blood in my veins. Children and sick family members were targets, liabilities. A woman in my position knew better than to give the ruthless men of the underworld that kind of leverage. I had spent my entire adult life fighting a solitary and desperate war against the crushing weight of medical debt, shielding my younger sister from the harsh realities of our poverty. The $420 invoice I had paid just hours ago, using my dwindling freelance funds, flashed in my memory like a warning siren. I didn't wait for his permission. I turned and walked rapidly toward the frosted glass door, my bare feet slapping urgently against the freezing concrete, the heavy cashmere coat billowing out behind me like dark wings. I bypassed 2 heavily armed guards who stepped aside seamlessly, opening the heavy steel door before I even had to reach for the biometric handle. The environment beyond the glass shifted instantly. The harsh industrial noise of the command center faded completely, replaced by the low, steady, and incredibly familiar mechanical hum of an oxygen concentrator. But this wasn't the rattling, 45-decibel nightmare of a machine that sat in the corner of our drafty queen's apartment. The one that constantly threatened to short-circuit if the heater was running. This was a state-of-the-art, hospital-grade respiratory delivery system, operating with near-silent, flawless precision. I departed the sterile quiet of the medical annex. The room was a pristine, brilliantly illuminated sanctuary of clinical white, brushed steel, and pale gray stone. A comprehensive vital signs monitor was mounted directly on the wall, displaying perfect, rhythmic green waveforms that mapped every heartbeat. And resting in the center of the room, on a highly advanced articulating hospital bed, covered in thick, luxurious heated blankets, was Elena. She was awake, the pale, translucent quality of her skin that constantly terrified me. The ashen gray that signaled her oxygen saturation was dropping, was entirely absent, replaced by a healthy, vibrant flush. The cheap plastic nasal cannula we usually relied on had been thrown away, replaced with a premium, heated humidifier interface that was delivering medical-grade oxygen at a perfect, uninterrupted flow rate. A specialized respiratory therapist in immaculate dark scrubs stood quietly near the corner, monitoring her charts on an iPad. "Elena," I cried, my tone breaking completely as the rigid, defensive walls I had maintained for 48 hours instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. I practically fell into the plush leather chair beside the bed, my shaking hands reaching out to grip her arm. The physical reality of her warmth under my fingers was a grounding shock. I scanned her face, my hypervigilant eyes searching for any sign of panic, trauma, or distress from being forcibly moved, but she simply looked back at me with a calm, deeply observant expression. "I'm fine, Clara," Elena said softly, her voice carrying a resonant strength I hadn't heard in months. She squeezed my hand, her gaze flicking over the massive, expensive overcoat I was wearing, a knowing smile playing on her lips. The medical transport team was incredibly fast. They bypassed the standard clinic protocols entirely. 1 minute, I was waiting for my quarterly pulmonary assessment in the waiting room. And the next, 4 men in bespoke suits were transferring my equipment into a fully armored ambulance. They didn't even hit a pothole on the way to Manhattan. I slumped forward, resting my forehead against the pristine white sheets, a profound agonizing wave of relief washing over my exhausted body. I had been so intensely focused on decoding the offshore routing numbers, so obsessed with maintaining my intellectual autonomy in the face of Dante's terrifying authority, that I hadn't realized he had already identified the critical vulnerability in my armor and completely encased it in steel. He hadn't used her to control me. He had secured her so no one else could. He didn't tell me, I whispered, lifting my head to look at her, the guilt gnawing at my conscience. I blocked his phone this morning at 7 o'clock. I revoked every tracking application he put on my devices. We had a massive fight last night about my independence, and I shut him out completely. I thought I was protecting us. Elena shifted slightly against the pillows, her eyes reflecting a quiet, profound understanding of the brutal world we had just been dragged into. Despite her physical illness, her mind was razor-sharp, unfiltered by the immediate somatic terror that constantly clouded my own judgment. "That is exactly why he didn't tell you, Clara," Elena said, her tone gentle but completely unyielding. "You thought blocking his number would create a boundary. You thought you could dictate the terms of your isolation by shutting down a phone line. But a man who rules a city like this doesn't respect digital boundaries. He doesn't need a phone line to speak." She gestured toward the expensive, life-saving machinery humming quietly in the corner of the room, a setup that would have easily cost more than my entire year's salary as a freelance accountant. His silence wasn't a retreat. My sister continued, articulating the exact psychological truth I had been too defensive to admit to myself. "When you cut off the communication, you expected him to argue. You expected him to demand your submission over a text message, to threaten your leverage. But his absolute silence was a deployment. He didn't waste time arguing with your wounded pride. He simply systematically dismantled our old life, secured the perimeter, and moved us into his fortress. He isn't asking for your permission to protect you, Clara. He is just doing it." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow to the sternum. The absolute, terrifying magnitude of his possession was not something I could outsmart with an encrypted firewall. I had demanded that he respect my intellect, and he had responded by executing a flawless tactical extraction of my only living relative, providing a level of medical care I could never achieve on my own, and he had done it all without demanding a single word of gratitude. He was proving that his protection was unconditional, not a transaction, an absolute reality. I sat in the quiet hum of the medical bay for another 10 minutes, watching the steady rise and fall of Elena's chest until the frantic, hyper-vigilant static in my brain finally quieted into a deep, focused calm. The crushing financial anxiety that had dictated every decision of my adult life. The constant, suffocating terror of missing a copay, of watching her struggle to breathe in a freezing apartment while I counted pennies, was simply gone, evaporated by the dark, silent power of the man bleeding in the next room. I stood up, adjusting the heavy cashmere coat around my shoulders, feeling its weight no longer as a cage, but as an impenetrable shield. I didn't need to hide behind my defensive walls anymore. I needed to finish the war I had started. "Get some sleep," I told Elena, brushing a stray strand of hair from her warm forehead. "I have a ledger to decrypt." I pushed back through the frosted glass door, stepping out of the sterile quiet of the medical annex, and back into the charged ozone-heavy atmosphere of the tactical bunker. The operatives at the monitors were still working with frantic, silent efficiency, typing lines of code and tracking GPS coordinates, but my eyes went straight to the mahogany desk. Dante was standing exactly where I had left him. He had finally allowed one of his field medics to properly suture the deep laceration on his right hand. The dark silk handkerchief had been replaced by stark, sterile clinical gauze, the white stark against the dark wool of his suit. He was staring up at a massive high-definition satellite feed displayed on the primary wall monitor, his posture rigid and commanding. I walked up to the edge of the desk, pulling my high-performance laptop from my messenger bag and setting it down gently next to the thornless black rose. Dante didn't look at the computer. He kept his cold, whiskey eyes locked on the screen above. "Your liability is secure," Dante stated, his voice devoid of any arrogance, delivering the fact with cold, clinical precision. "The medical annex operates on an independent subterranean power grid and is guarded by 3 operatives who answer only to me. You no longer have to calculate the cost of her survival against the cost of your freedom. The debt is erased. The perimeter is sealed." "I know," I murmured, my words steadying into a profound shared understanding. I looked up at his sharp profile. "Thank you." Dante finally looked down at me, the dark intensity in his gaze softening just a fraction, registering the physical shift in my posture. The defensive, shivering woman who had blocked his phone in a panic had been replaced by a grounded, highly competent professional ready to execute her role. "Watch the screen, Clara," he commanded quietly, gesturing toward the primary monitor with his bandaged hand, his knuckles wrapped tight in white. "You wanted to understand the absolute reality of my world. You wanted to know what happens outside the gilded cage when you strip away the firewalls and expose yourself to the street." I turned my attention to the massive digital display. The high-definition feed was a direct stream from a covert surveillance drone hovering low over a painfully familiar, bleak landscape. It was the street outside my old apartment in Queens. The winter blizzard was still raging, the heavy sleet violently distorting the amber glow of the broken streetlights. The narrow, trash-filled alleyway where the rival scout had nearly put a bullet in my chest. At 8 o'clock tonight was clearly visible, the fresh, driving snow failing to completely cover the dark, violent stains left behind by Marcello's weapon. As I watched, a sleek, heavily armored black sedan glided smoothly into the frame, its thick winter tires crunching silently over the iced asphalt. It pulled to a halt, directly against the snow-banked curb outside my front door. My breath caught in my throat. I instantly recognized the vehicle's predatory silhouette. The driver's side door unlatched, and a man emerged into the freezing, horizontal wind. Marcello Rossi. He wore the same tailored black overcoat he had worn during the ambush, his movements executing the exact same lethal, calculated discipline. But he wasn't drawing a weapon. He wasn't scanning the perimeter for a tactical breach or engaging hostile forces. He walked slowly, deliberately, up the crumbling concrete steps toward the front door of my empty apartment. The drone camera zoomed in, the sophisticated lenses instantly enhancing the low-light resolution. In Marcello's gloved hand, he was carrying a single object, a black rose. I frowned, my analytical mind momentarily stumbling over the visual data. I looked down at the mahogany desk in front of me, where the smooth, thornless black rose I had carried down from the penthouse was resting perfectly still. Then I looked back at the screen, watching the enforcer hold an identical dark crimson flower, its stem thick with vicious, unbroken thorns. "I don't understand," I whispered, the tactical implication escaping my immediate forensic logic. Marcello already delivered the message. "I have the rose. The one you hold is a concession to your boundaries," Dante explained, his lips dipping to a lethal, possessive whisper that sent a heavy shiver straight down my spine. He stepped closer, the immense heat of his massive frame pressing reassuringly against my shoulder as we both watched the monitor. "I had my men shave the thorns from the stem you carry, because you are terrified of the violence I represent. It is a physical promise that I will never let my world bleed you. But the rose Marcello is carrying still has its teeth." On the screen, Marcello reached the frozen threshold of my apartment. He didn't knock. He didn't attempt to pick the cheap brass deadbolt to search the premises. He simply laid the single, dark-petaled rose directly onto the center of the welcome mat. He turned, his dark eyes scanning the dark windows of the surrounding buildings, knowing perfectly well that the cartel scouts were watching him from the shadows. Before walking back to the armored sedan and driving away into the storm. Underworld semiotics, Dante continued, his whiskey eyes cold and merciless as he watched the rival scouts on a secondary thermal monitor immediately begin retreating from the block, utterly terrified by the simple botanical marker left in the snow. The rogue boss who funded this coup sent men to that address to liquidate an annoying freelance accountant. He thought you were a vulnerable civilian. By planting the Moretti rose at an empty location, I am publicly shifting the architecture of the war. It signifies that the territory is claimed. It tells the cartel that the asset they were hunting has been elevated to the highest echelon of my protection. I stared at the black rose resting in the snow on the screen, the absolute, devastating power of the symbol sinking deep into my logic. "It's a poisoned well," I realized aloud, my voice tinged with genuine awe at the ruthless efficiency of his strategy. "You didn't just extract me. You marked my old life as a death trap. Any rival who steps foot on that porch looking for leverage against me will be liquidated by your network before they even reach the door handle. In my world," Dante said, slowly turning his head to look down at me, the predatory possessiveness in his gaze, burning away any remaining shadows between us. "When I claim something as mine, I do not hide it in the dark. I dare the monsters to come and take it, and then I slaughter them." The words weren't a threat. They were the ultimate undeniable validation of my existence. I had spent years being entirely invisible, fighting a solitary war where my intelligence was undervalued, and my safety was constantly compromised by men who operated with zero discretion, men who viewed me as prey. Now, I was standing in the nerve center of an empire. backed by a man who was willing to poison the streets of New York just to ensure I could sleep without keeping one eye on the door. I didn't step away from his heat. I leaned into it, letting the sheer violent magnitude of his protection anchor me completely. Somatic hypervigilance that had plagued my entire adult life finally, completely flatlined. I reached out and opened the lid of my laptop. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark concrete of the bunker with a sharp blue glow. I picked up the encrypted USB drive containing the Moretti ledger, the exact architecture of a coup, the financial ruin of the men who had dared to put a gun to my chest. The corrupt logistician routed the stolen capital through 3 secondary shell corporations in Geneva, I declared, my tone ice cold, shifting instantly into the rhythm of a forensic professional executing a kill order. I plugged the matte black drive into the port, my fingers flying across the keyboard with absolute, unhesitating precision. The biometric lock is tied to my pulse. I am lifting the final firewall now. I will give you the exact IP addresses, the account numbers, and the names of every single associate he paid off. Dante placed his uninjured hand flat on the desk beside my laptop, leaning in close, his physical presence an immovable, absolute shield against the rest of the world. Pull the data, Clara. The Don commanded softly, a dark smile finally touching the corner of his mouth as he watched his sovereign partner go to war, and then we burned them to ash. The biometric mechanism disengaged with a soft synthetic click that echoed in my own ears like a heavy vault door swinging open. On the high-definition monitor of my laptop, the progress bar flashed a brilliant, unforgiving green. Suddenly, the massive tactical screens lining the concrete walls of the subterranean command center flared to life. The complex, labyrinthine network of the Moretti ledger, data I had spent the last 48 hours meticulously untangling in the suffocating warmth of the penthouse, spilled out in raw, irrefutable numbers. Terabytes of compressed logistics data unspooled across the main server. I watched the offshore holding accounts synchronize flawlessly with the local Manhattan mainframes. The encrypted routing IP addresses through secure international hubs cascaded down the primary display in rapid glowing columns, each one a definitive nail in a traitor's coffin. And then, the final layer of offshore encryption dissolved entirely. A high-resolution photograph materialized in the center of the largest screen. The face of the architect. It was the high-ranking traitor of Dante Moretti's southern logistics firm. A man I had passed in the corporate lobby a dozen times. A man who wore perfectly tailored $3,000 suits, drank expensive espresso, and smiled warmly at the receptionists, completely hiding the fact that he was the absolute architect of a treasonous underworld coup. I had found the missing variants in his shipping manifests. I had tracked the ghost payrolls. Now, his entire illicit financial empire was laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bunker. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and terrifyingly absolute. Dante didn't shout. He didn't slam his uninjured fist against the mahogany desk or display any of the volatile, explosive rage he had shown when he realized I had blocked his digital access hours ago. He simply straightened his posture, his broad shoulders shifting into the lethal, uncoiled stance of an apex predator who had just locked onto its prey. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet, the air growing thick and heavy with the promise of immediate violence. "Lock down the Brooklyn Navy Yard," Dante commanded, his deep baritone vibrating straight through the concrete floorboards. "Seal the perimeter. No vehicles enter or exit. Dispatch teams Alpha and Bravo. I want the executive vice president taken alive, and I want every single associate listed on that ledger detained before sunrise." The 10 heavily armed operatives moved with a synchronized, chilling efficiency. The low, rapid hum of tactical chatter erupted. Keyboards clattered like gunfire. The heavy steel doors of the subterranean armory at the far end of the bunker slid apart on frictionless tracks, revealing rows of matte black ballistics gear and sophisticated weaponry. The metallic clatter of high-capacity magazines clicking into modified tactical rifles echoed off the walls. The operatives transitioned seamlessly from digital surveillance analysts into a highly coordinated paramilitary strike force. The smell of gun oil and ozone thickened in the air, a harsh sensory reminder that the war had officially moved off my spreadsheets and onto the streets. I stood beside the mahogany desk, my hands resting flat on the polished wood, next to the single black rose I had placed there earlier, suddenly feeling incredibly small in my oversized cashmere overcoat. For 8 months, I, Clara Higgins, had been invisible, a ghost in the corporate accounting department fighting a solitary war against my sister Elena's medical debts. Now, I had just handed the most dangerous man in the city the exact coordinates for a massacre. I wasn't stealing the silverware. I wasn't raiding the liquor cabinet for vintage scotch. I was dismantling the very architecture of his enemies. Dante turned away from the monitors. He unbuttoned the jacket of his bespoke charcoal suit, shedding the garment with a fluid motion, and handed it to a passing operative. Underneath, his crisp white dress shirt stretched tightly across the heavy musculature of his chest and shoulders. He reached for a black Kevlar tactical vest resting on a nearby steel crate, pulling it over his head and securing the heavy Velcro straps tightly over his ribs. The jarring juxtaposition of his high society elegance and sheer underworld brutality was a visual paradox that made my pulse stutter. He checked the magazine of his sidearm, sliding it into the holster at his thigh with a sharp metallic click. Then, he walked back to me. The chaotic movement of the bunker seemed to blur into the background as he stepped into my personal space. The imposing heat radiating off his body was a direct contrast to the freezing draft of the concrete floor. His whiskey eyes dropped to my face, scanning my features with a dark, calculating intensity. He noted the dark circles under my eyes, the slight tremor still vibrating in my wrists, and the absolute exhaustion settling deep into my bones. "The ledger is open, Clara," Dante murmured softly, his voice meant only for me, amidst the roar of the mobilizing strike teams. He reached out with his uninjured left hand, his calloused fingertips gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from my cheek. The touch was agonizingly tender, a phantom caress that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. "The war is out of your hands now. Your part in the violence is over." "He had scouts outside my apartment," I whispered, the memory of the silenced pistol leveling at my chest in the Queen's alleyway flashing behind my eyes. "He knows I pulled the data." "He is a dead man," Dante corrected, his tone completely devoid of empathy, stating a forensic fact. "He just hasn't stopped breathing yet. You will not think of him again." He turned his head, his gaze cutting across the room to where his driver was strapping a tactical harness over his black overcoat. Marcello. His driver, Marcello Rossi, was at his side in a fraction of a second. "Boss, take her to the executive suite on floor 58. The inner sanctum," Dante ordered, his eyes never leaving mine. "Secure the perimeter. No one accesses that floor without my direct biometric clearance. You stay at her door until I return." "Understood," the enforcer replied with a curt nod. Dante looked back down at me. The stark white, clinical gauze wrapped around his knuckles was already blooming with a fresh stain of crimson, a visceral reminder of the crystal decanter he had shattered in his fury over my independence. "Sleep, Clara. When you wake up, the men who hunted you will be ash." He didn't wait for my response. He turned and strode toward the heavy blast doors, his enforcers falling into a rigid tactical formation behind him. The doors rolled open, swallowing the strike team into the subterranean darkness, and then slammed shut with a deafening, metallic finality. The sudden absence of his towering presence left a cold, breathless vacuum in the bunker. Marcello stepped forward. He reached down and carefully picked up the black rose from the tactical desk, holding the smooth, thornless stem with a deep, ingrained reverence. "Miss Higgins," he said quietly, breaking the heavy silence, "if you will follow me." I gripped the leather strap of my messenger bag, the empty casing of the USB drive still resting safely inside, and followed the enforcer toward a different, heavily secured elevator bank tucked into a recessed alcove of the bunker. The retinal scanner verified Marcello's identity, and the steel doors slid open. The ride up to the 58th floor was a silent, vertical ascent through the heavily fortified spine of the Moretti Empire. Unlike the glass-walled penthouse on the 60th floor, which offered panoramic, vulnerable views of the city, the 58th floor was an impenetrable vault. When the elevator doors parted, there was no natural light, no sprawling open-concept living space. The corridor was lined with Macassar ebony paneling, illuminated by low, warm amber sconces, and completely windowless. The air pressure was perfectly stabilized, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive stone cleaner. It felt exactly like stepping into the center of a highly secure, luxury panic room. Marcello walked me to the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. He bypassed the digital keypad, using a physical encrypted key to unlock the deadbolts. The heavy deadbolts disengaged with a series of solid, reassuring thuds. He pushed the door open but did not step inside. Instead, Marcello turned to face me. He held out the single black rose, delivering it to me on behalf of Dante, finally presenting his true message. I reached out and took the smooth green stalk, my fingers brushing the heavy black silk ribbon tied around its base. On the street, the perimeter was actively hostile. Marcello stated, his tone of course as deep rasp in the quiet corridor. I delivered the symbol to you, but I did not deliver his message in its entirety. Protocol requires that the message be spoken. I frowned, my exhausted mind struggling to process the formality of his tone. He already sent the message, Marcello. The rose was a concession. He shaved the thorns. He didn't just order it sent, Clara. Marcello corrected smoothly, his expression unreadable but his dark eyes intensely focused. I was watching a man dismantle his own defenses. When Dante realized you had blocked his digital access this morning, the sheer lack of control over your safety caused a fracture. He shattered a crystal decanter in his office. His hand was bleeding profusely. Yet, he refused medical sutures. I swallowed hard, a painful knot forming in my throat as I remembered the blood soaking through his silk handkerchief. He walked directly to the greenhouse on the roof. Marcello continued, his words landing with the heavy weight of an absolute truth. He cut that specific rose himself. He used his own blade to meticulously shave every individual thorn from the stem. He bled onto the marble floor so that you wouldn't bleed holding it. My breath hitched. I looked down at the dark, velvet petals in my hand, suddenly hyper-aware of the violent devotion it represented. The painstaking care required to strip a rose of its natural defenses, while bleeding from open lacerations, was a staggering testament to Dante's protective obsession. He instructed me to pass on his exact words, Marcello said, delivering the verbatim command of the syndicate boss. He said, inform her this is the only weapon I will ever lay down. Remind her she is a sovereign within my walls, but I will not let her walk into the crossfire. The rose is my surrender to her intellect, but my absolute claim on her survival. The words echoed in the empty amber-lit hallway, a dark possessive promise, dripping with an archaic brand of loyalty that thrilled the deepest, most exhausted parts of my soul. The night I walked out into the freezing Queen's reign was the night I officially surrendered to the most dangerous man in the city. I understand, I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. Marcello gave a single respectful nod. The suite is secure. I will be right outside this door. Get some rest, Miss Higgins. He reached out and pulled the heavy double doors shut. The mechanisms engaged automatically, sealing me inside the inner sanctum. I stood alone in the foyer of the executive suite. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of clean linen, cedar, and faint traces of bergamot. The somatic hypervigilance that had kept my muscles locked in a state of rigid panic for the last 24 hours finally, completely flatlined. I dropped my leather messenger bag onto the plush beige carpet. The heavy cashmere overcoat slipped from my shoulders, pooling in a dark heap on the floor, leaving me standing in my cheap, olive green blouse. I walked slowly into the primary bedroom. A massive king-sized bed dominated the space, covered in dark silk sheets and thick down comforters. The ambient lighting was low and soothing, expressly designed to pacify a shattered nervous system. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my knees weak, staring blankly at the black rose in my hand. The petals were impossibly dark, a velvet crimson that drank the low light of the room. I traced my index finger down the smooth, thornless stem, marveling at the clean, precise cuts where the jagged edges had been surgically removed. As my thumb brushed the base of the stalk, I felt a slight, rigid anomaly beneath the heavy black silk ribbon tied around it. My forensic mind, conditioned to detect the smallest inconsistencies in any given structure, instantly locked onto the texture. The ribbon was tied tightly, wrapped in a thick cylindrical knot that felt too stiff to be just folded silk. A 3% discrepancy in a botanical arrangement. My hands began to shake again, not from adrenaline, but from a sudden, profound anticipation. I picked at the knot. The silk was heavy and expensive, fighting my numb fingers for a moment before the loops finally gave way. The black ribbon unspooled, falling softly onto my lap. Hidden against the green stalk, previously concealed entirely by the tight wrap of the silk, was a small, tightly folded square of thick, cream-colored parchment. I held my breath. I picked up the paper, the heavy cotton texture rough against my fingertips, and carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Dante's. The strokes of the black ink were sharp, aggressive, and calculated, leaning slightly forward with a kinetic energy that mirrored the man himself. It wasn't a quick scrawl. It was a deliberate, meticulously penned confession. I read the words, the absolute silence of the vault amplifying the deafening volume of his truth. Clara, by the time you read this, you have either accepted my protection, or I have forced it upon you by securing the doors of the penthouse. You believe your algorithms and your firewalls can shield you from the men hunting your decrypted ledger. They cannot. Your logic, brilliant as it is, does not stop lead. I have watched you carry the crushing weight of your sister's life until it nearly broke your spine. I have watched you fight a solitary war in the shadows, demanding nothing from a world that took everything from you. I will not watch you carry a cartel war. I will not let the violence of my empire touch you. You fear the gilded cage. You fear the loss of your autonomy. But the men outside these walls do not negotiate with autonomy. They liquidate it. I am the violence you fear, but I am also the only impenetrable wall between you and the men who want you dead. I shaved the thorns from this stem with my own hands because I refuse to be another jagged edge in your life. I refuse to make you bleed to prove my strength. Stay in the fortress. Let me be the monster who keeps you safe in the dark, so you never have to look over your shoulder in the light. Dante, a single hot tear escaped my eyelashes, landing with a soft splash against the thick parchment, slightly blurring the black ink of his signature. I read the note a second time, then a third. The emotional authenticity of his confession shattered the last remaining defensive shield I had desperately clung to. He wasn't trying to diminish my intellect. He wasn't trying to possess me as a mindless asset to be stored away. He saw my brilliance, he validated my strength, but he was utterly, profoundly terrified of my physical vulnerability. The man who ruled the New York underworld, with absolute cold-blooded precision, was willing to bleed onto his own floors. Just to soften the edges of the symbol he gave me, I pulled my legs up onto the mattress, curling my knees to my chest. I pressed the handwritten note against my sternum, right over my racing heart, and closed my eyes. 74 days later, month 3, day 15, the snow outside the reinforced glass of Dante's primary penthouse was a swirling, chaotic whiteout, a brutal late winter storm battering Manhattan. But inside the library on the 60th floor, my new permanent workspace, no longer confined to the 58th floor vault, the air was heavy with the scent of burning cedar from the massive marble fireplace and the quiet hum of my encrypted servers. I sat at the mahogany desk, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. On the central monitor, the final remnants of the trader's illicit financial network dissolved into a permanent, irrecoverable zero. It had taken me over 2 months of relentless, surgical forensic accounting to fully expose the depth of the internal syndicate mole's treason. What had started as a mere 3% variance in the shipping logistics column had unspooled into a massive, labyrinthine web of offshore ghost payrolls and shell companies spanning continents. I had tracked every stolen cent. I had isolated every corrupt associate, seizing their accounts before Dante's strike teams ever kicked down their doors. I dismantled the architect's empire from the inside out, leaving him utterly bankrupt and isolated in the hours before Marcello and the operatives finally apprehended him. The war was over. I had provided the digital kill shots, and Dante had executed the physical retaliation with a terrifying absolute precision. But it was the screen to my left that currently held my undivided attention, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes and making my pulse flutter with an entirely different kind of adrenaline. It was the secure patient portal for St. Mary's Hospital. Patient, Elena Higgins. Current balance. I stared at the number, a lump forming in my throat that I couldn't swallow down. For the past 6 years, that balance had been a living, breathing monster in my apartment, a crushing weight that dictated every hour I worked, every meal I skipped, every desperate freelance contract I took. Only 3 months ago, I had drained my checking account to pay a single, isolated $420 invoice just to keep her oxygen treatments running. Now the entire $500,000 debt was gone, liquidated in a single untraceable wire transfer. But Dante hadn't just settled the arrears. He had secured a private medical trust in Elena's name, ensuring that her chronic respiratory illness would be managed by the top pulmonary specialists in the country, indefinitely, without me ever having to look at another medical bill for the rest of my life. The crushing financial anxiety that had defined my entire adult existence was simply erased. The heavy oak doors of the library clicked open. I didn't flinch. The somatic hypervigilance that used to keep my muscles locked in a state of rigid panic had completely flatlined over the last 2 months. I knew exactly who it was. Dante stepped into the room, bringing with him the faint, crisp scent of ozone and the deep, rich aroma of his bespoke charcoal suit. He had just returned from a final meeting with the syndicate heads, officially closing the chapter on the coup. He crossed the Persian rug with a silent, predatory grace that still made the breath catch in my lungs. He stopped behind my leather chair, leaning down slightly. His large, warm hands settled onto my shoulders, his long fingers pressing into the tense muscles at the base of my neck with a firm, practiced pressure. The electricity of his touch was instantaneous, a heavy grounding weight that tethered me to the present. "It's done," I murmured, tilting my head back slightly to lean into his touch. "The last offshore account is seized. The ledger is entirely clean." Dante's gaze flicked to the monitors, taking in the cleared servers and then, deliberately, shifting to Elena's patient portal. His jaw tightened, the sharp, aristocratic lines of his profile illuminated by the firelight. "The ledger was always the secondary objective, Clara," Dante stated, his words a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated right through the leather of my chair. He stepped around the desk, invading my personal space until he was standing directly in front of me. He reached down, grasping the armrests, and spun my chair slowly so that I was forced to look up into his dark, whiskey-colored eyes. "Your sister's transfer to the private wing at St. Jude's is complete," he continued smoothly. "Marcello oversaw the logistics personally. She is safe, she is breathing easily, and she is guarded by my best men. The debt is ash. I don't know how to repay this," I whispered, the sheer magnitude of his intervention washing over me. "It goes against every instinct I have to just let you carry this. You don't repay it." "And I am not asking you to carry anything," Dante replied, his tone absolute, cutting through my ingrained, working-class defensiveness with surgical precision. "I promised you the night I handed you that black rose. You are a sovereign within my walls. You dismantled my enemies with your brilliance. You protected my empire when my own men were blind to the rot." He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. When he withdrew his hand, he was holding a small, matte black velvet box. My breath hitched. The air in the library suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Dante clicked the box open. Resting on the dark satin interior was a ring. It wasn't a standard diamond. It was a massive, flawless custom sapphire, cut with brutal, sharp angles and surrounded by a halo of smaller, glittering diamonds. The stone was a deep, mesmerizing ocean blue, a color that mirrored the cold, clinical logic of my forensic world, yet set in a heavy platinum band that screams of untouchable underworld wealth. "This isn't a negotiation," Dante murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with a dark, territorial intensity that sent a shiver straight down my spine. "And this is not a gilded cage. It is a crown. In my world, when I claim something as mine, I protect it absolutely. If we do this, if we become this, you're mine. Fully, and I don't share. I don't let go." He reached out, his calloused fast thumb gently brushing the pulse point at my wrist, feeling the rapid, erratic beat of my heart. "Anyone who looks at this sapphire will know exactly who you belong to," Dante promised, his pitch descending to a low, velvet resonance. "They will know that if they touch you, if they even look at you with the wrong intent, I will burn their world to the ground and scatter the ashes. Touch her and die. That is the new law of my syndicate." I looked from the staggering beauty of the ring, up to the beautiful, dangerous man offering it. He wasn't asking me to surrender my intellect. He was arming me with his power. He had shaved the thorns off the black rose so I wouldn't bleed, and now he was giving me a sapphire that would act as an absolute shield against the rest of the world. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my left hand. I didn't tremble. I didn't hesitate. Dante slid the heavy platinum band onto my ring finger. The metal was cold for barely a microsecond before it absorbed the heat of my skin, settling into place with a definitive, unyielding weight. He leaned down, cupping my jaw with both hands, and pressed his lips to mine. The kiss was a vow, deep, commanding, and consuming. It tasted of expensive scotch and raw, unchecked devotion. I gripped the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer, anchoring myself to the man who had shattered every defense I had ever built. Outside, the frozen Manhattan winds battered against the reinforced glass, fighting a losing battle against the impenetrable fortress Dante had built around me. I had started this journey as an invisible ghost, drowning in medical debts and running from violent shadows in a Queens alleyway. Now, wrapped in the scent of cedar and the absolute protection of the most dangerous man in the city, I was stepping into the light. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was reigning. The heavy platinum band on my left ring finger was a constant, tactile reminder that the architecture of my life had been fundamentally, permanently altered. It had been exactly 3 days since Dante Moretti placed the massive, flawless custom sapphire on my hand in the 60th floor library of his Manhattan penthouse, claiming me with a possessive intensity that still made the breath catch in my throat. The crushing financial anxiety that had dictated every waking moment of my adult existence, the endless calculus of survival, the late-night panic attacks over utility bills, the terrifying reality of poverty, was completely eradicated. The $500,000 medical debt was ash. I was no longer a ghost in the corporate accounting department, fighting a solitary war against a world that constantly tried to grind me into dust. I was a sovereign within his walls. The private wing of St. Jude's Respiratory Clinic was not a standard medical facility. It was a high-security luxury sanctuary. The ambient environment was meticulously calibrated to promote healing, smelling faintly of crushed eucalyptus, sterile linens, and the subtle, expensive scent of polished mahogany. Every entrance was locked behind military-grade biometric scanners, the perimeter actively monitored by the silent, lethal enforcers of Dante's syndicate. For the first time in 8 agonizing years, the somatic hypervigilance that kept my muscles locked in a state of rigid, defensive panic had begun to flatline. I had allowed myself the incredibly dangerous luxury of letting my guard down. I had walked out of Elena's recovery suite to retrieve 2 cups of chamomile tea from the VIP lounge down the pristine, windowless corridor. The ceramic cups were warm against my palms, a comforting, domestic sensation that contrasted sharply with the violent underworld politics I had recently decoded on my encrypted servers. As I walked back toward the suite, I paused in the hallway, looking through the massive, floor-to-soiling soundproof glass wall that separated the corridor from the clinic's enclosed botanical solarium. Inside the glass dome, the late winter sunlight filtered through the reinforced panes, casting a warm golden glow over the lush, humid jungle of exotic orchids and broadleaf ferns. My younger sister was standing near a tiered stone fountain, right in the middle of the space. The sight of her sent a profound wave of relief through my chest. She wasn't confined to a hospital bed. There was no cheap plastic nasal cannula taped to her face. She was standing on her own, her posture relaxed, breathing the purified, humidified air with an effortless grace that felt like an absolute miracle. She reached out, her pale fingers gently touching the vibrant, violet petals of a blooming orchid. The heavy frosted glass service doors at the far end of the solarium slid open on frictionless tracks. 3 men stepped into the botanical garden. They were wearing the standard slate gray uniforms of the clinic's maintenance staff, pushing a large metallic utility cart. To a casual observer, they were entirely invisible, just another part of the background machinery that kept the facility running. But I was a forensic accountant. My entire professional survival depended on identifying microscopic anomalies in massive, complex systems, and my analytical brain instantly locked onto the terrifying discrepancies in their presence. It wasn't their clothing. It was the sheer, rigid geometry of their posture. Standard maintenance workers operated with a casual, lethargic rhythm, burdened by the physical toll of their labor. These men walked with a terrifying, synchronized tactical precision. They wore heavy, rubber-soled combat boots instead of standard-issue slip-resistant shoes. The slate-gray shirts stretched unnaturally across their torsos, revealing the rigid, rectangular outlines of Kevlar vests and the heavy, undeniable bulges of concealed firearms tucked into their waistbands, a 3% variance in their motion. But to me, it screamed like a siren in a silent room. They weren't here to fix a broken ventilation shaft. They fanned out the moment they cleared the doorway, their eyes scanning the perimeter, deliberately positioning themselves to block the primary exits and obscure the angles of the overhead security cameras. They were following Elena. I screamed, my voice tearing through my throat. The ceramic cups slipped from my numb fingers. They shattered against the polished marble floor of the corridor, splashing boiling amber liquid across the toes of my leather boots. But I didn't feel the heat. A violent, icy tremor erupted in my wrists, radiating up my arms until my chest tightened into a breathless, agonizing knot. Elena, they aren't maintenance. Run away from them. My voice was heavily muffled by the thick glass, but the sharp action and the shattering of ceramic caught her attention. She turned, her brow furrowing in confusion just as the lead hostile reached beneath his uniform. Look at their boots, I shrieked. sprinting the remaining 20 yards to the biometric glass doors that separated the hallway from the solarium. They're armed, hide behind the stone fountain. Now, I slammed my thumb against the optical scanner, expecting the immediate, reassuring click of the heavy deadbolts disengaging, so I could pull her into the safety of the corridor. The LED light on the scanner flashed a harsh, unforgiving crimson. The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin cold and clammy. They hadn't just bypassed the physical security. They had deployed a localized network jammer, hijacking the local subnet and locking the doors from the inside. The syndicate mole may have been dead, but the rival mafia families he had funded were still active, and they were desperate. They didn't care about the logistics ledgers anymore. They wanted leverage against Dante, and they had managed to track down the single, breathing vulnerability he had elevated to the highest echelon of his protection. Inside the solarium, the ambient noise of the cascading fountain masked the heavy thud of the men's boots. Elena backed away, her expression shifting instantly from peaceful contemplation to raw, unfiltered shock as she registered the weapons. "Clara, what's happening?" Elena shouted, her voice barely penetrating the reinforced pain. "Stay low, do not let them grab your arms." I yelled back, slamming both of my fists against the thick pane of glass. The impact sent a jarring, painful shockwave up my forearms, but the soundproof vacuum of the clinic's architecture swallowed the noise completely. I watched, trapped in a state of absolute, suffocating paralysis, as the lead figure pulled a suppressed 9mm pistol, leveling it directly at her chest. The second man unspooled a length of thick, heavy-duty tactical zip ties. They cornered her. They advanced in a tight, predatory formation, forcing Elena to back up until her shoulders hit the cold, reinforced glass wall of the corridor, mere inches from where I was standing on the outside. "Clara, help me!" Elena cried out, pressing her palms against the glass, her eyes wide with a terror that ripped straight through my soul. The panic attempting to drown my logic was absolute, a blinding white noise that threatened to short-circuit every survival instinct I possessed. But as the lead hostiles raised his left hand to grab Elena's arm, the cold, clinical calculation that had kept me alive in the corporate shadows violently reasserted itself. My autonomy couldn't stop lead. I couldn't shatter the bulletproof glass with my bare hands. But my intellect knew exactly how to dismantle their tactical advantage. I stopped pounding on the impenetrable barrier. "Elena, cover your eyes, close them and drop to the floor," I instructed quietly, stepping up behind him in my memory of survival tactics. But now I yelled it with the sharp, commanding edge that belonged to a sovereign, not a victim. I didn't wait to see if she understood. I spun around and lunged for the clinic administration terminal built into the wall 10 feet away. The terminal was locked, a standard Windows login screen staring blankly back at me. I didn't need the password. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a hard reboot and accessing the clinic's BIOS and command prompt before the operating system could fully load. I had spent the last 2 months dissecting the most fortified financial mainframes in the world. A localized hospital subnet was an absolute joke. I bypassed the security firewall in 12 seconds. I pulled up the network routing tables, my eyes scanning the hexadecimal codes for the localized anomaly. There, IP address 192.168.4.50 was flooding the local switches with a denial of service attack, locking out the biometric scanners. I couldn't cut the jammer's power from here, but it hadn't overridden the secondary environmental controls that ran on an isolated analog circuit. I accessed the solarium's high-intensity UV botanical growth lights and the emergency fire suppression system. "Let's see how you shoot blind," I hissed under my breath. I initiated a high-frequency strobing sequence on the UV overheads and maxed out the humidity valves. Instantly, the glass dome erupted into a blinding, disorienting flash of purple-white light, pulsing like a strobe at a vicious frequency. The hostiles flinched violently, raising their arms to shield their eyes as the sudden, overwhelming glare destroyed their night-adapted vision. Simultaneously, the overhead sprinklers hissed to life, dumping a heavy blinding mist of cold water and chemical fire suppressant across the indoor jungle. "Go, shift right," I shouted through the glass, slamming my left wrist against the terminal console. Strapped next to the heavy platinum ring was a sleek, matte black encrypted smartwatch Dante had locked onto me the night I decrypted his ledgers. It wasn't connected to the clinic's local network. It operated on a direct, independent satellite relay tied straight to his primary enforcers. I pressed the 2 side buttons simultaneously, and held them down for 3 agonizing seconds, activating the absolute, unblockable distress beacon. Inside the solarium, Elena used the distraction flawlessly. The strobe lights and the sudden downpour of heavy mist disoriented the man with the zip ties. She didn't collapse into a weeping, helpless victim. She displayed the exact same fiercely resilient spine that had kept us alive in poverty. Dodging his initial grasp and shoving a heavy ceramic pot of orchids directly into his path to disrupt his footing, before diving behind the thick-tiered stone fountain. "Don't let her escape." The lad hostile barked, his voice distorted and faint through the glass. He raised the suppressed pistol higher, his finger tightening on the trigger, as he stepped blindly through the strobe-lit mist to force her compliance. Before the firing mechanism could engage, the entire architectural structure of the solarium shuddered. The heavy frosted glass service doors at the far end of the greenhouse didn't just open. They were violently, explosively blown off their reinforced hinges. The deafening concussion of a breaching charge shattered the tranquil silence, blowing a cloud of pulverized drywall and thick gray smoke across the indoor jungle. The hostiles spun around, their tactical discipline fracturing in the face of sudden overwhelming aggression. Marcello Rossi stepped through the smoke. He wasn't wearing medical scrubs. He wore his signature tailored black overcoat, a towering silhouette of lethal, uncoiled discipline. He didn't shout a warning. He didn't negotiate. In the brutal economy of the underworld, hesitation was the currency of the dead, and Dante's right-hand enforcer operated with an absolute, terrifying surplus of speed. 2 suppressed shots spit from his weapon in a blur of motion. Center mass, head. The lead hostile holding the gun dropped to the terracotta tiles instantly, entirely eradicated before his brain could even register the breach. The remaining 2 men scrambled to raise their weapons, but they were already ghosts. The heavy glass doors on the lateral sides of the solarium kicked open simultaneously. 4 of Dante's elite security operatives flooded the botanical garden, advancing with a synchronized, predatory fluidity that made the rival assassins look like absolute amateurs. Weapons down. One of the operatives roared, though it wasn't a request. It wasn't a firefight. It was a flawless, methodical execution. The sharp, staccato cracks of suppressed gunfire echoed rapidly through the humid air. The scent of sweet orchids was instantly overpowered by the harsh, metallic tecordite and the distinct copper of fresh blood. Even separated by the reinforced glass, as I pressed my hand flat against the pane, exactly where Elena's pale fingers touched the other side, the heavy weight of the sapphire ring on my finger bit into my skin like ice. It was a brutal physical anchor, a grounding reality that dragged my hyperventilating lungs back to the truth of my survival. Dante's ring wasn't just a promise. It was an absolute perimeter. Within 4 seconds of Marcello breaching the room, all 3 hostile targets were neutralized, their bodies collapsing into the lush foliage. "Clear!" one operative shouted. "Left side secure," another confirmed. The enforcer didn't bother checking the pulses of the men on the floor. He knew his own lethal mathematics perfectly. He holstered his weapon in one fluid motion and strode directly across the room. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of the stone fountain. "Miss Elena," Marcello's deep, rough rasp cut through the lingering haze of gun smoke and the hissing sprinklers. "Are you injured? Did they touch you?" "No," Elena gasped, coughing slightly from the smoke as she stood up. "I'm okay." The strobe lights blinded them. Marcello offered his gloved hand, pulling her up from behind the stone tier. He turned his back to her, facing the smoke-filled entrance, placing his broad, imposing physical frame between my sister and the carnage on the floor. He formed an impenetrable human shield of absolute loyalty. "Extract her to the secure corridor." Marcello ordered, the 2 operatives flanking him. "Proceed." A sharp electronic beep echoed in the corridor. The LED light on the biometric scanner beside me instantly shifted from angry crimson to a brilliant, forgiving green. The localized network jammer had been destroyed by the security detail, restoring the building's mainframe. The glass doors slid apart. I didn't walk. I sprinted into the solarium, my boots slipping slightly on the fallen leaves and shattered terracotta. I collided with Elena, my arms wrapping around her shoulders in a crushing, desperate grip. I pulled her against my chest, my hands frantically checking her arms, her neck, her back. "I have you," I breathed out, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "I'm right here. I'm okay, Clara." "I'm okay," Elena whispered, her voice trembling slightly with the adrenaline, but her breathing remained remarkably steady. She hugged me back fiercely, burying her face into my shoulder. Not a single scratch. Not a single drop of blood on her hospital gown. I couldn't see anything when the lights started flashing, but I heard you telling me to run. You did perfectly, I told her, kissing her forehead, as a profound, staggering wave of absolute relief washed the remaining terror from my veins. You did exactly what you needed to do. I slowly pulled back, keeping one arm securely wrapped around her waist, and looked up. Mars was standing 3 feet away, his posture relaxed, but his dark eyes continuously scanning the perimeter of the glass dome. The violence he had just unleashed was completely compartmentalized, his expression a mask of perfect, professional neutrality. The perimeter is secure, Ms. Higgins, Marcello stated, adjusting the heavy cuffs of his dark overcoat. He gave a single deeply respectful nod. The threat has been entirely neutralized. I apologize for the delay. The jammer scrambled our primary comms. You breached in under a minute, I answered, my tone steady, confident, the cold, analytical logic of my profession returning. They were using military-grade encryption on that jammer. Did you recover the localized relay? Operative Team 3 is securing the hardware now, Marcello replied, his tone clinical and precise. We will extract the raw data. No one touches Dante's family. I don't just want the raw data. I want the law of the jammer, I demanded, holding Elena tightly against my side. The hex codes I saw on the administration terminal were sloppy, but they had to be routed through a dark web proxy. If I cross-reference the MAC address of their hardware with the financial offshore accounts I flagged yesterday, I can trace the exact origin of the purchase. I want to know exactly which rival family paid for this hit. You want to track their funding, Marcello observed, his dark eyes sharpening. I want to bleed them completely dry before Dante even reaches them, I declared, my tone ice cold, completely devoid of the panic that had consumed me moments ago. I will strip their accounts until they can't afford to buy a single bullet. Marcello's gaze dropped briefly to the massive sapphire ring on my left hand. A faint, grim smirk touched the corner of his mouth, the closest expression to absolute approval I had ever seen from the silent enforcer. Dante instructed me to provide you with whatever you need, Ms. Higgins. The data will be delivered to your private servers at the penthouse within the hour. Thank you, Marcello, Elena murmured, her voice steadying. She looked at the bodies on the floor, then up at the towering man who had just executed them without a second thought. Thank you for coming. It is my absolute duty, Ms. Elena, Marcello said, dipping his chin. We have an armored transport waiting at the south exit. Dante is already en route from Manhattan. I tightened my grip on Elena, looking down at my hand. The heavy platinum band on my finger pressed cold and solid as against my skin. The sharp, acrid scent of cordite mixed violently with the humid aroma of crushed eucalyptus and wet soil. The harsh glare of the emergency strobes cast long, chaotic shadows across the bodies bleeding out on the marble floor. My gaze traced the flawless sapphire on my hand, the blue stone glinting in the harsh light. The reality of my new life wasn't wrapped in a tidy bow, and it wasn't a peaceful escape from the world's cruelty. It was the copper of blood on the tiles. It was the brutal, unyielding weight of Dante's ring anchoring my soul. And it was the absolute, concrete fact that the most lethal man in New York had just burned the clinic to the ground to keep my sister breathing. Marcello guided us through the fractured remains of the solarium, his broad shoulders shielding Elena from having to look at the lifeless bodies bleeding out among the crushed ferns. We bypassed the main lobby entirely, utilizing a sterile, subterranean service corridor that only the highest-tier syndicate operatives knew existed. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly, casting long, erratic shadows against the concrete walls, but I didn't flinch. I was no longer afraid of the dark. I belonged to the man who ruled it. When we emerged into the freezing air of the underground parking garage, the heavy, reinforced chassis of Dante's armored SUV was already idling by the loading dock. 2 more operatives stood guard at the perimeter, their hands resting casually but deliberately near the lapels of their coats. Inside now, Marcello instructed, his voice low and devoid of panic, pulling open the heavy ballistic steel door. I guided Elena into the expansive leather interior, sliding in right behind her. The door slammed shut with a heavy, airtight thud that instantly severed us from the chaotic noise of the city. The ambient temperature inside the vehicle was perfectly calibrated, warm and thick with the familiar, grounding scent of cedar, expensive leather, and the faint, lingering trace of Dante's scotch. It was an olfactory fortress. Elena sank into the plush leather, pulling her knees to her chest, her breathing finally beginning to hitch, as the adrenaline slowly evaporated from her system, leaving behind the raw, shivering reality of what had just occurred. I reached across the console, pulling a heavy cashmere blanket from Thor's compartment and wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. "You are safe," I told her, my voice steady, leaving no room for doubt. "They cannot touch you here. Nobody can." Marcello climbed into the driver's seat, the engine giving a low, predatory growl as he accelerated up the concrete ramp and merged aggressively into the Manhattan traffic. He didn't turn on the sirens. He didn't speed erratically. He drove with a terrifying, calculated precision, weaving through the congested avenues like a ghost. I didn't waste time staring out the tinted windows. I raised my left wrist. A violent, delayed tremor seized my hands, the physical reality of the near-death encounter finally crashing through my system and leaving raw, freezing terror in its wake. My fingertips were slick with cold sweat, slipping clumsily against the matte black surface of the encrypted smartwatch Dante had locked onto me. I couldn't grip the bezel. I couldn't stop shaking. I closed my eyes, forcing a deep, ragged breath that tasted of cedar and safety, grounding myself against the heavy leather seat. I wasn't a victim anymore. I repeated the truth, but the adrenaline continued to misfire through my veins. I had to press the edge of my right hand hard against the heavy leather center console of the SUV, physically anchoring my wrist to stop the violent tremors. Taking another shuddering inhale, I locked my joints into place, letting my clinical, analytical focus ruthlessly override the panic. My fingers flew across the glass. The primary servers at the penthouse had already received the raw data extraction from the destroyed jammer. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh, pale blue light, as lines of code and routing tables cascaded across the miniature display. "Miss Higgins," Marcello said from the front seat, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Dante is waiting for us at the secure drop point. He has already mobilized the remaining strike teams. He requires the target coordinates." "Give me 60 seconds," I replied, my tone completely devoid of the lingering adrenaline. I bypassed the standard firewalls of the proxy server, slicing through the digital obfuscation with the brutal efficiency of a scalpel. They had routed the purchase of the localized network jammer through 3 different shell companies in the Cayman Islands, but they had made a single microscopic error in their currency conversion protocols. A fraction of a cent variance in the crypto ledger. I pulled the thread. The entire financial architecture of the transaction unraveled in my hands. "Got it," I whispered, the cold calculation in my chest solidifying into absolute, unyielding rage. The payment for the hit squad was authorized from a private holding account tied to the rival syndicate. They transferred the funds 48 hours after Dante dismantled our internal mole. "The rival syndicate," Marcello repeated, the term tasting like ash in the quiet cabin. "They are operating out of the shipping warehouses at the Queen's docks." "Not anymore," I stated, my tone remarkably steady as my fingers flew across the digital keyboard to initiate a brute force override on the rival faction's holding accounts. "I am freezing their primary liquid assets. They won't be able to pay their remaining soldiers, and they certainly won't be able to buy a flight out of the city." I locked the transaction and sent the encrypted coordinates directly to the mainframe. "Tell Dante the accounts are locked. The rival syndicate is entirely blind and broke. He can proceed with the sweep." Marcello gave a single sharp nod, tapping his earpiece. The armored SUV surged forward, eating up the asphalt as we crossed the bridge back into Manhattan. The towering, illuminated skyscrapers rose up around us like a gilded cage, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't trapped on the outside looking in. I held the keys. We bypassed the main entrance of Dante's high-rise entirely, slipping into the subterranean private garage, reserved exclusively for his inner circle. The vehicle hadn't even come to a complete stop before the heavy steel doors of the private elevator bank slid open. Dante Moretti stood in the threshold. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the dark, coiled ink of the syndicate tattoos climbing up his forearms. The raw, predatory tension radiating from his massive frame was suffocating, completely transforming the atmosphere of the concrete garage into a high-pressure vacuum. His stormy gray eyes swept over the armored vehicle, scanning the perimeter with the ruthless calculation of a warlord who had just been told his sanctuary was under siege. Marcello killed the engine and stepped out, giving a sharp, deferential nod. They are unharmed. Dante didn't look at his enforcer. He crossed the concrete floor in 3 massive, purposeful strides, pulling the heavy passenger door open. The freezing winter air rushed into the cabin, but all I could feel was the overwhelming, absolute gravity of his presence. "Clara," he breathed out, the single syllable a harsh, gravelly rasp that tore straight through my defenses. I didn't wait for him to reach in. I unbuckled my seatbelt and practically threw myself out of the vehicle. Dante caught me instantly, his heavy, muscular arms wrapping around my waist and pulling me flush against his solid chest. The impact knocked the breath out of my lungs, but I didn't care. I buried my face into the curve of his neck, inhaling the deep, intoxicating scent of cedar, expensive scotch, and the cold winter storm. His large hand cupped the back of my head, his fingers threading through my hair in a crushing, possessive grip that grounded my fractured nerves completely. "Are you hurt?" Dante demanded, his voice vibrating against my collarbone. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled back just enough to inspect my face, his thumbs gently but firmly tilting my chin up. His eyes darted across my skin, checking my pupils, my neck, my shoulders, searching for any microscopic sign of physical trauma. "I'm fine," I murmured, my words steadying under the weight of his intense, absolute protection. "I'm fine, Dante. Elena is safe." Dante looked past me into the cabin, his lethal gaze softening for a fleeting moment as he took in the sight of my younger sister wrapped in his cashmere blanket. Elena gave him a weak, trembling smile. "Welcome to your new home, Elena," Dante said, his tone shifting into something remarkably gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he commanded. "No one will ever threaten you again. I swear it on my life." He turned his attention back to me, his thumbs brushing against the heavy platinum ring on my left hand. "You traced the jammer." "The rival syndicate," I confirmed, stepping closer to him, allowing his body heat to seep into my shivering frame. "I locked their offshore accounts. They have no liquidity. They are completely exposed." Dante's jaw locked, a dark, terrifying promise of absolute ruin flashing in his eyes. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. In our world, the most dangerous men didn't need to raise their voices to orchestrate a massacre. He simply pressed a hard, lingering kiss to my forehead, claiming me, shielding me, and sealing the fate of our enemies in a single motion. "Marcello," Dante ordered, never taking his eyes off mine. "Take Elena up to the guest wing. Have the medical staff evaluate her immediately." "And you?" I asked, my fingers gripping the crisp fabric of his shirt. "I am going to the Queen's docks," Dante stated softly, the terrifying calmness in his voice sending a violent shiver down my spine. "You found the anomaly, Clara. You dismantled their shield. Now, I am going to burn the rest of their world to ash." He pulled away, but not before lacing his fingers through mine, the cold metal of his ring pressing intimately against my skin. It was a promise, a contract written in blood and encrypted ledgers. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was the architect of his empire, and together we were untouchable. The private elevator ride up from the subterranean garage was a stark, vertical ascent through a profound silence. The heavy steel doors sealed off the scent of exhaust and the freezing winter air, replacing it with the highly engineered ozone-filtered atmosphere of the Moretti high-rise. I stood perfectly still in the center of the amber-lit cab, my spine rigid, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of the machinery pulling us upwards. My younger sister leaned heavily against the paneled wall, her eyes closed, the adrenaline crash finally dragging her into a state of profound, unavoidable exhaustion. Besides us, Marcello remained a towering, immovable pillar of dark wool and lethal discipline. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him, but the faint, dark speckles of blood on his right cuff, the only physical evidence of the executions he had just carried out in the botanical solarium, were screaming in my peripheral vision. The elevator chimed at the 50th floor, the guest wing. The doors slid open to reveal a pristine, softly illuminated corridor, where 2 members of Dante's private medical staff were already waiting, flanked by another pair of armed operatives. They moved with a quiet, synchronized efficiency, guiding Elena out of the cab and toward her new impenetrable sanctuary. I stepped forward, my hand gripping her shoulder for one final, grounded second. The physical reality of her warmth beneath the heavy cashmere blanket was the only metric that mattered. She gave me a small, exhausted nod, her eyes reflecting a silent understanding of the violent world we were now fully submerged in, before disappearing behind the heavy oak doors of the medical suite. The elevator doors closed again, leaving just me and the enforcer. The cab resumed its rapid ascent toward the 60th floor penthouse. I didn't look at Marcelo. I stared at the brushed steel paneling, my forensic brain automatically shifting gears from immediate survival mode to complex post-incident data analysis. The numbers I had decrypted in the armored SUV were currently colliding with the timeline of events from the past 72 hours. A massive, glaring discrepancy was forming in my mind, a logical flaw in the narrative I had been operating under. We stepped out into the sprawling, multi-million-dollar living space. The ambient temperature was a perfect, unvarying 72 degrees, a manufactured warmth that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic whiteout of the blizzard, still raging beyond the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. The city below was a blurred, amber-lit abyss. I walked slowly toward the chef's kitchen, the heavy platinum band on my left ring finger, feeling incredibly dense, almost magnetic, against my skin. I braced my hands flat against the cold marble of the central island. I needed a glass of water. I needed a mundane, physical task to anchor my racing thoughts. I pulled a crystal tumbler from the overhead cabinet and filled it from the filtered tap, watching the condensation immediately begin to bead on the cold glass. "The routing numbers," I replied, my tone tight, echoing sharply in the quiet, soundproofed room. I didn't turn around. "Yes, Miss Higgins," Marcelo replied smoothly. He had stopped at the edge of the foyer, maintaining a respectful, calculated distance. My fingers curled tightly around the edge of the marble counter. I had just analyzed the hexadecimal timestamps on the cryptocurrency ledger. The funds for the hit squad had cleared exactly 48 hours ago. The morning after my explosive argument with Dante, right when I blocked his cellular network. I turned around, leaning my weight against the island. He knew. Dante intercepted their financial chatter before they even dispatched the scouts to my apartment in Queens. Marcelo did not flinch. His dark eyes remained perfectly steady, absorbing my accusation without a shred of denial. In the underworld, silence was often the most profound confirmation. "He let me scream at him for withholding data," I whispered, the realization hitting my sternum like a physical blow. "He let me believe he was a possessive monster. Because you are a forensic accountant, Clara." Marcelo stepped further into the ambient light. "You operate on logic, risk assessment, and independent action. If Dante had informed you that an active hit was out on your only living relative, you would have attempted to extract her yourself. You would have been killed before you reached the end of your street." The raw, unfiltered truth of his words stripped the breath from my lungs. "He absorbed your hatred," the enforcer continued, his tone a heavy, coarse rasp. "He intentionally triggered your defensive instincts to keep you anchored to these floorboards. He took the blame, and he shattered his own hands in frustration, all to ensure you remained perfectly stationary while we dismantled the threat." I looked down at the massive custom sapphire glittering on my left hand, the brilliant blue stone catching the amber light of the room. The sheer, staggering magnitude of Dante's sacrifice was overwhelming. He hadn't fought me to break my intellect. He had fought me to absorb the crossfire. He had played the villain in my narrative so that I wouldn't become a casualty in his. "He used his silence as a deployment," I whispered, repeating the exact psychological truth Elena had pointed out to me in the subterranean medical annex days ago. "Dante Moretti does not command an empire by explaining his tactics to the enemy," Marcelo said quietly, "and he does not protect what is his by asking for permission." The driver gave a single, deferential nod, signaling the end of his explanation. "I will be stationed outside the primary elevator doors. The perimeter is absolute. No one can reach you here. Please, try to rest." He turned and walked out of the living space, the heavy doors sealing shut behind him with a definitive click. I was entirely alone in the sprawling, luxurious vacuum of the 60th floor. But the silence no longer felt like isolation. It felt like an impenetrable fortress, constructed entirely from the dark, unwavering loyalty of the man who was currently bleeding at the Queen's docks to guarantee my tomorrow. I pushed away from the kitchen island, leaving the glass of water untouched, a small ring of condensation marking the marble where it sat. My bare feet moved silently across the silk blend rugs as I walked down the long, macassar ebony-paneled hallway toward the primary suite. The ambient lighting was low and warm, designed to pacify a shattered nervous system. I pushed open the heavy bedroom door. The space was dominated by a massive king-size bed covered in dark silk sheets, but my attention was immediately drawn to the sleek, modern nightstand next to it. Resting perfectly centered on the polished wood was the object Marcelo had handed me on the freezing sidewalk days ago. The black rose. I walked over and picked it up. The velvet petals were impossibly dark, a deep consuming crimson that seemed to drink the low light of the room. I traced my index finger down the smooth, green stalk. The edges of the outer petals were just beginning to dry out, a microscopic, natural biological reality that contrasted sharply with the sterile, timeless perfection of the penthouse. But the stem remained flawless. Every single jagged edge, every sharp thorn that could have caused me pain, had been meticulously, surgically shaved away by Dante's own blade. I sat on the edge of the mattress, resting the flower across my lap. The heavy black silk ribbon tied around its base was slightly frayed, where I had unknotted it to find his handwritten confession. My professional life had trained me to view every human interaction as a transactional ledger. Credits and debits. Leverage and vulnerability. For years, my survival depended on never giving the world an opening to hurt me. When Dante first pulled me into his violent orbit, my sympathetic nervous system had operated at a deafening frequency. I had analyzed his imposing physical presence, his immense wealth, and his ruthless authority as extreme liabilities. I thought submitting to his protection meant erasing my own identity, trading my intellectual sovereignty for the passive role of a kept woman. I lifted my left hand, staring at the platinum band encircling my ring finger. The custom sapphire was a brutal physical anchor. It wasn't a chain. It was a declaration of war against anyone who dared to threaten my peace. He hadn't erased my identity, he had armed it. When I decrypted the offshore routing numbers and handed him the treacherous insider I had exposed, he hadn't patted me on the head and told me to hide. He had stood beside me at the tactical desk, acknowledging me as the engineer of his enemy's ruin. He had respected my brilliant, calculating mind, even when that mind was actively building firewalls to keep him out. The hypervigilance that had plagued my entire adult life, the constant, exhausting tension in my shoulders, the jumpiness at sudden loud noises, the terrifying certainty that disaster was always one unpaid medical bill away, was simply gone. It had been systematically dismantled, not by therapy or time, but by the absolute, concrete fact that the most lethal man in New York was willing to poison the streets and burn his own hands to keep me safe. Some stories didn't have neat endings. Some involved living daily in spaces between right and wrong, justice and compromise, love and complications. I looked out the massive bedroom window. The blizzard was finally beginning to break, the heavy, blinding sheets of snow reducing to a slow, drifting flurry over the Manhattan skyline. The sky was taking on the bruised, violet hue of a late winter dawn. Dante was out there. He had left the subterranean garage hours ago, mobilizing his elite strike teams to sweep the Queen's shipping warehouses. He was currently standing in the freezing cold, executing the final violent liquidation of the rival syndicate's assets. He was out there shedding blood to guarantee the absolute finality of our safety. And I was sitting in a perfectly climate-controlled 72-degree vault, holding a flower. A sudden, profound restlessness seized my muscles. It wasn't the frantic, panicked energy of a victim trying to escape. It was the grounded, absolute certainty of a partner recognizing her place on the board. The ledger was clean. The medical debts were ash. The enemies were blind and broke. Dante had surrendered his thorns to me, offering me the only weapon he would ever lay down. I could not sit in the gilded cage and simply wait for him to return with the spoils of a war we had fought together. I stood up, my spine rigid, the soft silk of the bedsheet slipping away from my legs. I carefully placed the black rose back onto the nightstand, letting it rest beside the small, cream-colored parchment containing his handwritten note. I walked to the expansive walk-in closet, bypassing the soft, luxurious loungewear his staff had stocked for me. Instead, I reached for the heavy, tailored cashmere overcoat, his overcoat, the one I had worn like an armored shield in the command bunker. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, letting the heavy wool settle onto my shoulders. The scent of cedar, expensive leather, and the faint trace of his scotch instantly enveloped me, steadying my pulse into a slow, rhythmic beat. I emerged from the bedroom and walked deliberately down the hallway, the heavy hem of the coat brushing my calves. I didn't hesitate as I approached the massive, steel-reinforced double doors of the primary elevator. I pressed the biometric call button. The optical scanner registered my thumbprint, flashing a brilliant, accepting green. The doors slid open. Marcelo was standing exactly where he said he would be, a silent, immovable guardian in the ambient light of the private foyer. He looked up, his dark eyes registering the heavy overcoat, the absolute determination in my posture, and the flawless sapphire gleaming on my left hand. He didn't ask if I was leaving. He didn't attempt to block my path. "The sweep at the docks is nearing completion, Miss Higgins," the enforcer stated, his voice a low, respectful rasp. "The perimeter is highly volatile." "I know," I replied, my tone completely devoid of the panic that had once defined me. I stepped fully into the elevator cab, looking directly into the eyes of the syndicate's most lethal soldier. "Take me to him." The drive from the pristine subterranean garage of the Manhattan high-rise to the industrial wasteland of the Queens waterfront was a journey through two entirely different realities. I sat in the rear of the armored Mercedes SUV, my spine perfectly straight against the plush leather seat, watching the city blur past the bulletproof glass. The brutal, blinding whiteout of the midnight blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a freezing, heavy fog that clung to the asphalt and swallowed the ambient glow of the streetlights. The interior of the vehicle was a silent, temperature-controlled vault, smelling deeply of cedar, expensive upholstery, and the faint, lingering trace of Dante's scotch. But the psychological landscape inside my mind was shifting with seismic force. For the past 8 months, my entire existence had been defined by a desperate, hyper-vigilant defense against poverty and violence. I had meticulously calculated every risk, viewing every interaction as a potential threat to my sister's survival. When I had blocked Dante Moretti's private cellular network at 7 o'clock yesterday morning, I believed I was severing a digital tether to a controlling monster. Now I understood the terrifying absolute devotion behind his silence. He hadn't demanded my submission. He had simply absorbed my hatred, allowing me to build my digital firewalls while he stepped into the crossfire to dismantle the cartel hunting me. Marcello navigated the slick, icy roads with a terrifying, predatory grace, his dark eyes constantly sweeping the mirrors for any sign of pursuit. He did not speak. The enforcer understood that the architecture of my life had just been fundamentally altered, and he afforded me the silence required to process the shift. I looked down at my left hand, resting on the heavy cashmere of Dante's oversized overcoat that I wore like a suit of armor. The flawless custom sapphire glittered in the dim cabin light, the massive stone set deep into a thick platinum band. It was not a gilded cage, it was a declaration of absolute sovereignty. By wearing his ring, I was no longer an invisible freelance accountant terrified of the shadows. I was the architect of his enemy's financial ruin, and I was actively choosing to walk onto the battlefield, to stand beside the man who had burned his own hands to protect my peace. The sleek vehicle veered sharply off the main commercial avenue, descending into the labyrinthine access roads of the southern shipping yards. The aesthetic of wealth and corporate legitimacy vanished instantly, replaced by the brutalist, rusted infrastructure of the underworld logistics network. Towering stacks of corrugated steel shipping containers loomed in the freezing fog like the skeletal remains of a forgotten city. The massive mechanical loading crane stood entirely motionless against the bruised, violet sky of the pre-dawn morning. We approached a heavy chain-link perimeter fence. It had been violently breached. The heavy steel gates were completely torn off their hinges, lying twisted and crushed on the frozen pavement. Beyond the destroyed threshold, the true magnitude of the syndicate's retaliatory sweep became brutally apparent. Marcello brought the armored SUV to a smooth, crawling halt at the edge of the central loading yard. He killed the headlights, leaving only the engine's low, predatory idle vibrating through the floorboards. I looked out through the reinforced windshield. The massive, primary warehouse belonging to the rival faction, the men funded by the treacherous insider I had exposed, was a catastrophic, smoking ruin. The heavy steel bay doors had been blown inward by shaped breaching charges. Harsh, blinding white halogen work lights, powered by portable generators, had been erected in a tactical circle around the compound, casting stark, unforgiving shadows across the frozen concrete. Dozens of heavily armed operatives in matte black tactical gear moved methodically through the wreckage, securing the perimeter, seizing the illicit cargo, and liquidating the last remaining fragments of a criminal empire that had dared to put a gun to my chest. The air outside the vehicle looked thick and toxic, heavy with the black smoke of burning contraband and the freezing moisture of the river. "The physical threat has been neutralized, Ms. Higgins," Marcello stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that broke the silence of the cabin. He shifted the vehicle into park, the heavy transmission clicking into place. The primary hostiles are deceased or detained. But a post-raid environment is inherently unstable. It is a graveyard of unpredictable variables. Standard orders demand that you remain inside the armor. Those orders didn't intercept the financial chatter 48 hours ago, I replied, my tone steadying against the sheer weight of what we had achieved. I reached for the heavy chrome door handle, and standard procedures didn't shave the thorns off a black rose so I wouldn't bleed. I am done hiding in the vault, Marcelo. I need to clarify the conditions of my future. The enforcer did not attempt to lock the doors. He simply gave a single deferential nod, unbuckling his own harness. I will flank you. Keep your hands inside the pockets of the overcoat and stay exactly 2 paces behind my right shoulder. I pulled the heavy latch and the armored door swung open. The physical assault of the environment was instantaneous. A brutal, sub-zero wind rolling off the East River bit viciously into my cheeks, carrying the sharp, acrid stench of cordite, pulverized concrete, and the undeniable metallic copper of fresh blood. The damp cold immediately attempted to seep into my bones, but the immense residual warmth of Dante's tailored cashmere overcoat acted as an impenetrable thermal shield. I stepped out onto the icy asphalt in my bare feet, having completely forgotten to find proper footwear in the penthouse before demanding to be taken to the docks. The freezing slush shocked my skin, the sharp grit of the pulverized gravel, biting viciously into my unprotected soles, spreading a terrifying numbness up through my toes. But my forensic brain compartmentalized the physical discomfort with ruthless efficiency. I was not here to be comfortable. I was here to establish a sovereign partnership. Marcelo fell into step beside me, his tall, broad frame acting as a natural windbreak and a lethal deterrent to anyone who might question my presence. We walked past the shattered security checkpoint. The syndicate operatives, men who trafficked in violence and terror, on a daily basis, paused in their sweeping maneuvers as we approached. Their hardened eyes tracked my bare feet, the oversized coat swallowing my frame, and the massive sapphire catching the harsh halogen light. Not a single man spoke. They simply lowered the muzzles of their tactical rifles and stepped back, carving a silent, respectful path through the wreckage for the woman who held the decryption keys to their universe. I scanned the chaotic perimeter with clinical precision, my eyes searching through the drifting smoke and the harsh glare of the work lights. I found him standing near the edge of the deep-water harbor, silhouetted against the dark, churning currents of the river. Dante Moretti was an imposing, terrifying monument of underworld authority. He had discarded his suit jacket hours ago. His crisp white dress shirt was stained with soot and dark, terrifying smears of crimson. The fabric pulled taut across the heavy musculature of his shoulders. The black ballistic tactical vest strapped across his chest absorbed the ambient light. He was holding a suppressed submachine gun loosely in his left hand, the weapon angled toward the ground with a casual, lethal familiarity. He was speaking quietly to 2 of his lieutenants, his posture radiating an uncoiled, predatory tension that commanded the absolute submission of everyone in his orbit. As the crunch of my bare feet on the icy gravel registered over the sound of the freezing wind, Dante turned his head, his stormy whiskey eyes locked onto mine. The reaction was a violent, instantaneous shift in atmospheric pressure. The cold, calculated composure of the syndicate leader vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute, furious shock, his eyes narrowing to lethal slits as he took in my barefoot stance. He dropped the tactical conversation immediately, waving the lieutenants away with a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. He closed the distance between us in 4 massive, aggressive strides, his heavy boots crushing the frozen debris. Marcelo. Dante roared, his gravelly baritone easily overpowering the howling wind and the mechanical hum of the generators. The sheer volume of his voice was a terrifying rarity, an explosion of protective fury that made the surrounding operatives flinch and turn away. What is she doing outside the perimeter? Why is she out of the vault? The driver did not cower. He stepped slightly to the side, maintaining his professional neutrality. She requested the transport boss. She decoded the timeline. Dante didn't look at his enforcer. His dark eyes remained entirely fixed on me, dropping to take in the sight of my freezing bare feet on the asphalt, the heavy drape of his own overcoat, wrapping my shivering frame, and the unyielding, defiant tilt of my chin. His right hand, still heavily wrapped in the pristine white medical gauze from where he had shattered the crystal decanter in the penthouse, flexed instinctively. He wanted to grab me, to throw me over his shoulder, and physically dragged me back into the impenetrable safety of the armored vehicle. But he was bound by the promise he had made when he gave me the ring. "The airspace is clear, but the ground is toxic, Clara," Dante growled, stepping into my personal space, his immense body heat instantly neutralizing the freezing wind blowing off the harbor. He towered over me, a dark, imposing shield. "This is not a corporate boardroom, it is an active kill zone. I specifically ordered you to stay in the 60-floor fortress until the ash settled. And I know why you ordered it," I stated, my tone remarkably steady. I tilted my head up, holding his furious gaze with absolute, unblinking clarity. I analyzed the cryptocurrency timestamps. The transaction that paid for the hit squad cleared exactly 48 hours ago. You intercepted the chatter before we even had that fight. Dante's chest heaved once, a slow, heavy intake of freezing air. The fierce anger in his eyes faltered for a heartbeat. "You knew they were hunting my sister," I continued, my words striking with the precision of a scalpel, cutting away the final layers of our toxic misunderstanding. "And instead of telling me the truth, you played the villain. You let me believe you were just a possessive monster trying to lock me in a cage." I reached out from the folds of the oversized cashmere coat. I pressed my palm flat against the center of his tactical vest, directly over his heart. The steady, powerful rhythm of his pulse beat against my fingertips. "You absorbed my hatred," I whispered, the emotional authenticity of the realization making my voice tremble slightly, though my posture remained rigid. "You intentionally triggered my defensive hyper-vigilance so that I would barricade myself inside the penthouse, keeping me perfectly stationary and protected while you took the crossfire. You bled onto your own floorboards to shave the thorns off a rose, just so I wouldn't have to carry the weight of the violence." Dante looked down at me, the harsh halogen light catching the deep, exhausted shadows beneath his eyes. He reached up with his left hand, his calloused fingers gently wrapping around my wrist, his thumb brushing over the massive sapphire ring he had placed there hours ago. "Your intellect is a weapon, Clara," Dante murmured, his voice dropping to a low velvet resonance that was meant entirely for me. "But your empathy is a vulnerability. If I had told you that an active hit squad was closing in on Elena, your logic would have fractured. You would have left the high-rise. You would have attempted to run, to outsmart a cartel war with a laptop and a messenger bag. I could not allow you to step into the dark. I needed you angry, and I needed you anchored." "It worked," I acknowledged, swallowing the painful knot of guilt in my throat. "Your tactical deployment of silence kept me alive. It kept my sister breathing. But I am not here to thank you for the deception, Dante. I am here to clarify the conditions of our future." His eyes narrowed slightly, a calculating, predatory focus returning to his gaze. "You do not negotiate the terms of your protection. I negotiate the terms of my partnership," I fired back, my fingers curling tightly against the rough ballistic fabric of his vest. "I am not a fragile asset you can store in a vault and manage with psychological manipulation. I am the woman who found the tiny structural flaw in a corporate ledger. I am the architect who froze the bank accounts of the men bleeding out on this concrete. I accepted your ring, Dante. I accepted your sovereignty. But that means I share the ledger, all of it." I took a half step closer, forcing him to look down into the absolute, unyielding truth in my eyes. "Never again," I vowed, my tone a fierce, quiet promise in the freezing wind. "You do not absorb the hatred to keep me stationary. You do not play the monster to shield me from the reality of our world. If there is a threat, you give me the data. If there is a crossfire, we stand in it together. You do not get to be the isolated, silent savior anymore. I am your equal in the architecture of this life, and I will not let you carry the darkness alone." The silence that stretched between us was heavier than the winter fog. Dante stared at me, processing the sheer, staggering magnitude of my demand. For his entire life, he had ruled through absolute control, isolating himself at the apex of a violent empire, trusting no one with the burden of command. And now, a fiercely independent forensic accountant, standing barefoot in the freezing slush, was demanding to help him carry the crown. A slow, dark smile touched the corner of his mouth, a genuine expression of profound, terrifying devotion that completely transformed the hard angles of his face. He didn't offer a verbal agreement. In his world, actions were the only currency that mattered. He shifted the tactical rifle to his back, sliding it securely onto its sling, freeing both of his hands. He reached down, gripping my waist with his bandaged right hand in his left, and lifted me effortlessly off the freezing asphalt. I gasped at the sudden vertical shift, my hands instinctively grabbing his broad shoulders for balance. He didn't set me down. He held me suspended, removing my bare feet from the ice, his imposing physical strength acting as a literal, grounding foundation. "You want the raw data, Clara?" Dante whispered fiercely, his breath fanning hot across my cold cheeks. His whiskey eyes burned with an intense possessive fire. "You want to stand in the crossfire as my equal? Then you never walk onto a frozen battlefield without your armor again. You are my sovereign, and I will share every violent secret in this syndicate with you. But I will still burn the city down if you forget to wear your shoes." A breathless, authentic laugh escaped my lips, the sheer absurdity of his reprimand breaking the heavy tension of the confrontation. I wrapped my arms securely around his neck, burying my face into the crook of his collar, inhaling the sharp scent of ozone, gunpowder, and the deep, rich cedar of his skin. The terrifying hypervigilance that had ruled my life was entirely, permanently gone. I was safe. Not because I was hidden in a cage, but because I was held by the monster who guarded the gate. Then, the world violently shattered. It wasn't a mechanical groan or the hum of a generator. It was the sudden, sharp, high-velocity crack of a high-caliber rifle. An unsuppressed, deafening explosion of sound that ripped through the heavy fog and echoed brutally off the corrugated steel of the shipping containers. The sound of the gunshot was immediately followed by the terrifying, metallic shriek of a bullet ricocheting off the reinforced steel chassis of the armored SUV parked exactly 20 feet behind us. "Down!" Dante roared, the dark devotion in his eyes instantly vanishing into absolute lethal instinct. He didn't drop me, he didn't push me away. He moved with a terrifying, explosive kinetic energy that defied his massive size, twisting his torso violently to interpose his own body directly between the trajectory of the gunfire and my exposed back. His heavy boots dug into the icy gravel, and he launched us both backward, tackling me toward the cover of a massive, rusted steel shipping container stacked at the edge of the loading zone. We hit the freezing, wet asphalt hard. The impact knocked the breath completely out of my lungs, a blinding flash of white pain erupting behind my eyes as my shoulder slammed into the ice. But I didn't feel the full, crushing force of the fall. Dante had manipulated his center of gravity in mid-air, taking the brunt of the collision against his own back and ribs, curling his massive frame completely over mine. He pressed me flat against the frozen ground, his heavy tactical vest grinding against my chest, his arms caging my head to shield me from the immediate spray of pulverized concrete and shattered ice erupting around us. The air instantly filled with the deafening, chaotic roar of automatic weapons. The surviving remnant of the rival faction, a desperate suicide squad that had apparently hidden deep within the subterranean smuggling compartments of the warehouse, bypassing the initial sweep, had breached the surface. They weren't trying to escape. They had seen the head of the Moretti syndicate standing in the open, and they were executing a final, fanatic assault. "Contact front! Elevated!" Marcello's voice bellowed over the gunfire, entirely devoid of panic, operating purely on lethal discipline. The syndicate operatives in the yard reacted with terrifying speed. The harsh white halogen work lights exploded under a hail of incoming suppressive fire, plunging our section of the loading dock into a chaotic, strobing nightmare of muzzle flashes and deep, violent shadows. Dante was a crushing, immovable weight over my body. The smell of cordite and the metallic tang of his blood from his previously injured hand overwhelmed my senses. I couldn't see the shooters. I was entirely pinned beneath the heavy cashmere overcoat and the unforgiving bulk of his ballistic armor, a silent, desperate shield against the chaos. "Stay perfectly still," Dante commanded, his voice a harsh, guttural vibration directly against my ear. He didn't wait for my confirmation. He unslung his submachine gun with one hand, bracing his elbow against the asphalt beside my head, and returned fire in short, controlled, deafening bursts. The noise was absolute physical agony. The kinetic compression of the air with every shot fired, inches from my face, made my eardrums ring, with a high-pitched, piercing static. But the forensic accountant inside me, the sovereign partner who had just demanded to share the crossfire, refused to surrender to the blinding panic. I kept my breathing shallow, locking my joints into place, forcing my analytical mind to process the sensory data of the war zone. I listened to the terrifying, staccato impacts of the enemy bullets slamming into the corrugated steel of the container shielding our right flank. Crack ping, crack ping. The rhythm was slightly irregular, but the acoustic signature of the spalling metal was distinct. I calculated the fraction of a second between the sound of the muzzle report and the impact on the steel. The ricochets. I shouted over the deafening roar of the firefight, my voice raw, pressing my face into the crook of his neck, to ensure he could hear me. Dante, the angle of the sparks. They aren't on the ground. Dante ceased his suppressive fire for a microsecond, his body still completely covering mine, his jaw clenched tight with the effort of shielding my entire frame. He absorbed my data instantly, his own tactical mind seamlessly integrating my forensic observation. They're shooting at a downward trajectory, I gasped, my fingers gripping the thick straps of his ballistic vest. A 3% variance in the drop angle. Container stack 4B, they're on the third tier. Marcelo? Dante roared, trusting my calculation without a single shred of hesitation. Stack 4B. Third tier elevation. Suppress the nest. Copy. Marcelo's voice echoed through the chaotic dark. Instantly, the concentrated firepower of the entire Moretti security detail shifted from the ground-level rubble directly up to the towering silhouette of the shipping containers 40 yards to our left. The deafening roar of 30 tactical rifles, firing in unison, was a sound of apocalyptic destruction, tearing through the thin corrugated steel of the elevated sniper nest like wet paper. But the rival squad had already adjusted their sights. Before the suppressive fire could completely eradicate their position, a final, desperate burst of high-caliber rounds rained down on our exact coordinates. I heard the terrifying, visceral sound of lead tearing through the heavy steel edges of our cover, sending a shower of burning shrapnel raining down onto the wet asphalt. Suddenly, the massive frame covering my body jerked violently. Dante let out a sharp, suppressed grunt of pure agonizing pain, the sound vibrating directly into my chest. The kinetic energy of a heavy impact transferred straight through his ballistic vest, the sheer force of it pressing him harder against me for a terrifying, breathless second. He had taken a direct hit. Dante, I screamed, my hands flying frantically across his back, searching blindly through the heavy wool of his shirt and the thick ballistic armor, my forensic composure shattering into raw, unadulterated terror. He didn't collapse. He didn't roll away to assess his own trauma, despite the violent, concussive impact that had just compromised his physical integrity. The head of the Moretti syndicate refused to yield an inch of his protective shield. He clamped his left arm tighter around my head, pressing my face into the safety of his shoulder, while his right hand maintained a lethal, uncompromising grip on his weapon, firing the last remaining rounds in his magazine into the dark. "I have you," Dante ground out through clenched teeth, his breath ragged and heavy against my cheek, fulfilling the absolute promise of his sovereignty, as the deafening roar of the firefight reached its devastating, violent crescendo. The deafening roar of the firefight abruptly ceased, replaced by a ringing, high-pitched vacuum in my eardrums. The silence that fell over the Quinchiti shipping yard was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a graveyard. The acrid, burning stench of cordite and pulverized concrete was so thick I could taste the bitter ash on my tongue. I was pinned beneath the crushing weight of Dante's massive frame, my face pressed into the rough, soot-stained fabric of his collar. The freezing slush beneath my back soaked through the thin material of my olive-green blouse. But the cold was entirely irrelevant. All my forensic, analytical focus was concentrated on the terrifying, ragged hitch in the breathing of the man shielding me. He had caught a direct hit. "Dante," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper against his skin. My hands, trembling violently, slid out from beneath the protective cage of his arms, reaching frantically up to his broad back. My fingertips brushed against the thick, abrasive nylon of his tactical vest. The material was shredded. Right below his left shoulder blade, the heavy ballistic weave had been violently torn open, exposing the shattered fragments of the ceramic trauma plate underneath. I felt the jagged, deformed edge of the high-caliber round lodged deep into the armor. The vest had stopped the penetration, but the sheer kinetic energy of a rifle round striking at that velocity was devastating. It was a blunt force trauma capable of snapping ribs into shrapnel and collapsing a lung. He shifted his weight, letting out a low, guttural groan that he immediately tried to suppress. He pushed up on his left forearm, lifting his massive chest just enough to look down at me. His stormy whiskey eyes were tight with pain, the harsh lines of his jaw locked in a rigid display of sheer willpower. The pristine white gauze wrapping his right hand was completely soaked through with fresh crimson, the blood smearing across my own pale skin where he had gripped me. "Are you hit, Clara?" Dante demanded, his voice a harsh, gravelly rasp that prioritized my survival over his own fractured anatomy. He didn't check his own back. He was visually scanning my face, my shoulders, my chest, searching for any trace of blood that didn't belong to him. I'm fine. You caught the round, I answered, my tone steady, confident, the clinical calculation in my brain, fighting a desperate battle against the overwhelming surge of panic. I pressed my palm flat against the center of his chest, feeling the rapid, heavy thud of his heart. The ceramic plate shattered. You have severe kinetic trauma to your left posterior ribs. Do not try to stand up too quickly. If a bone is fragmented, a sudden shift in posture could puncture the pleural cavity. A dark, genuine fraction of a smile touched the corner of his mouth, despite the obvious agony radiating through his torso. A forensic accountant diagnosing ballistics trauma on the ice. You never cease to amaze me, Sovereign. Clear. The booming voice of Marcello Rossi echoed through the freezing fog. The crunch of heavy tactical boots rapidly approached our position behind the rusted shipping container. I looked past Dante's shoulder. The enforcer appeared from the smoke, his weapon still raised at a low ready, his dark eyes sweeping over the two of us. The surrounding operatives were moving with ruthless, synchronized precision, securing the perimeter and verifying the absolute neutralization of the sniper nest on Stack 4B. The elevated hostiles are eliminated, boss, Marcello reported, his tone entirely devoid of adrenaline, a machine delivering raw data. The perimeter is completely sterilized. Medical transport is standing by at the secondary extraction point. Cancel the transport, Dante grunted, using his uninjured hand to push himself off the frozen asphalt. The movement was slow, deliberate, and clearly agonizing, but he refused to show weakness in front of his men. He knelt on one knee, reaching down to grip my waist, hauling me up from the freezing slush with terrifying, unyielding strength. We are not utilizing a public route or an exposed medical facility. We are returning to the 58th floor, immediately. Dante, you need an X-ray, I argued, my hands instinctively gripping his forearms to help support his massive weight. The freezing wind whipped my hair across my face, but I ignored it, my focus entirely locked on the slight, unnatural stiffness in his posture, the kinetic impact. Not a negotiation, Clara. He cut me off softly, his gaze dropping to meet mine. The ground is toxic. The only safe zone is the vault. I am not bringing you to a hospital where a secondary strike team could orchestrate a breach. You wanted to share the reality of my world. This is it. We do not bleed in public. I stared into his unwavering whiskey eyes. He was in immense physical pain, but his protective protocols were absolute. He would rather risk internal bleeding than expose me to another uncontrolled environment. I didn't argue further. I gave a single sharp nod, slipping my arm around his waist, wedging my shoulder under his uninjured side to offer whatever leverage my smaller frame could provide. Get us to the SUV, Marcello, I declared, my tone ice-cold, hardening into the sharp, commanding edge of a woman who fully understood the weight of the massive custom sapphire ring glittering on her left hand. Yes, Miss Higgins. The walk back to the armored Mercedes was a brutal exercise in endurance. The freezing slush bit viciously into my bare feet, the sharp gravel tearing at my soles, but the somatic discomfort was completely overridden by the terrifying, heavy reliance of Dante's body, leaning slightly against mine. We moved through the wreckage of the Queen's loading yard, surrounded by a phalanx of heavily armed operatives. The burning warehouse illuminated the sky in a chaotic fiery orange, casting long demonic shadows across the ice. It was a landscape of absolute devastation, the physical manifestation of the war I had uncovered in a corporate spreadsheet. Marcello opened the heavy ballistic door of the SUV. I guided Dante into the rear cabin, climbing in immediately behind him. The doors slammed shut, sealing inside the temperature-controlled sanctuary. The heavy, airtight thud instantly severed the deafening roar of the generators and the howling wind. The ambient heat blasted against my freezing, wet skin, carrying the familiar, grounding scent of cedar and expensive leather. Dante slumped back against the plush seat, his eyes closing briefly as the adrenaline finally began to ebb, allowing the raw, unfiltered agony of the shattered ribs to register. His breathing was shallow, rapid, meticulously controlled to prevent his chest from expanding fully. I didn't sit passively. I unbuckled my seatbelt, sliding across the leather bench until my knees were pressed against his thigh. I reached out, my trembling fingers gently unfastening the heavy Velcro straps of his tactical vest. He didn't stop me. He lifted his arms slightly, a silent concession of his vulnerability, allowing me to strip the ruined tactical armor from his torso. The heavy rig fell to the floorboards with a dull thud, the deformed bullet clattering against the metal chassis. Beneath the vest, his pristine white dress shirt was soaked in cold sweat and the dark smears of his own blood from his shattered hand. I placed my palms flat against his chest, analyzing the rhythm of his respiration. "Talk to me," I demanded, my voice low and clinical, masking the profound terror vibrating in my chest. "Do you taste copper? Is there any sharp, localized stabbing pain when you inhale, or is it a dull, widespread ache?" "Dull, widespread," Dante murmured, his head resting back against the headrest, his gray eyes opening to look at me. "The lung is intact, Clara. The ceramic plate distributed the force. It is likely a hairline fracture and extensive deep tissue contusion." I let out a slow, shuddering breath, the absolute paralyzing fear finally releasing its grip on my throat. I slid my hand down, lacing my fingers through his uninjured left hand, the cold metal of my platinum ring pressing intimately against his skin. The drive back to Manhattan was a blur of flashing city lights, and Marcello's flawless, hyper-evasive driving. I didn't look out the tinted windows. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Dante, my thumb tracing the prominent veins on the back of his hand. We had survived the crossfire, we had walked onto a frozen battlefield, dismantled an empire, and returned alive. But the cost was written in the blood, soaking through the gauze on his right hand, and the shallow, painful hitches in his breathing. When the armored SUV finally descended into the subterranean private garage of the Moretti high-rise, the heavy steel blast doors rolling shut behind us felt like the ultimate, definitive closing of a violent chapter. We bypassed the command bunker completely. Marcello escorted us directly into the private elevator, swiping his biometric clearance to send the cab shooting straight up to the 58th floor. The inner sanctum. The corridor was silent, illuminated by the warm amber sconces, reflecting off the Macassar ebony paneling. Dante waved off the two armed guards stationed at the threshold, refusing their assistance. We walked through the heavy double doors into the executive suite. The ambient warmth of the room was intoxicating. I dropped the heavy cashmere overcoat onto the carpeted floor of the foyer, feeling the immediate absence of its armored weight. Dante moved slowly toward the massive, dark marble cathedral of a bathroom, his jaw clenched tight. I followed him instantly. The bathroom was a sprawling, hyper-luxurious space, all dark stone, heated floors, and polished chrome fixtures. Dante stopped in the middle of the bathroom, bracing his left hand against the edge of the massive double vanity. His reflection in the sprawling mirror was a terrifying portrait of underworld violence, his face smeared with soot, his hair disheveled, the crisp white shirt ruined. "Remove the shirt," I instructed quietly, stepping up behind him. He didn't argue. He began to unbutton the garment with his uninjured hand, his movements slow and agonizing. I brushed his hand away. "Let me." I stepped into his space, my smaller hands moving deftly down the placket of his shirt, slipping the buttons free. The proximity to his immense body heat was overwhelming. I peeled the ruined fabric off his broad shoulders, pulling it down his muscular arms until it fell to the heated marble floor. I walked around behind him, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the damage. The left side of his sculpted, heavily tattooed back was a canvas of brutal trauma. A massive, horrifying contusion was already blooming across his ribs. A deep, violent mosaic of angry purple, bruised black, and swollen crimson, perfectly tracing the rectangular outline of the shattered ceramic trauma plate. The skin was scraped raw in the center, where the kinetic force had been most concentrated. It was a terrifying physical manifestation of the bullet that was meant to tear through my spine. "Sit down," I replied, my tone completely devoid of weakness, hiding the unshed tears that I absolutely refused to let fall. I pointed to the heavy leather bench situated beneath the frosted glass window. Dante complied, lowering his massive frame onto the leather with a suppressed grunt. I moved methodically, my forensic mind shifting seamlessly into a clinical, caretaking rhythm. I opened the mirrored cabinets, retrieving sterile saline, heavy-duty medical gauze, antiseptic solution, and a roll of cohesive bandages. I grabbed a thick, white cotton towel, running it under the warm water of the chrome faucet until it was steaming. I knelt on the heated marble floor beside the bench. I started with his right hand. The pristine white gauze his field medic had applied hours ago was completely saturated, the edges stiff with dried blood. I carefully unwound the bandage, exposing the deep, jagged lacerations across his knuckles and palm, where he had crushed the crystal decanter in his bare hand. The wounds were brutal, self-inflicted out of sheer, protective terror when he realized I had blocked his digital access. "This needs sutures," I murmured, my thumbs gently pressing the edges of the lacerations to assess the depth. I poured the antiseptic solution over the open wounds. Dante didn't flinch. His whiskey eyes were tracking my every movement, analyzing the steady, unhesitating precision of my hands. "The medic can close it tomorrow. Just wrap it." I didn't argue. I cleaned the dried blood from his skin with the warm, damp towel. The contrast between his violent, calloused hands and my gentle, meticulous touch creating a profound, heavy silence in the room. I wrapped his hand tightly in fresh, sterile gauze, securing the edges with surgical tape. Then I shifted my position, moving behind his broad back to address the massive contusion on his ribs. I pressed the warm towel gently against the raw, abraded skin in the center of the bruise. The heat radiating from his musculature was intense. My fingers lightly traced the perimeter of the swelling, checking the structural integrity of the bone beneath the damaged tissue. "I told you I would stand in the crossfire as your equal," I whispered, the silence of the vault finally giving way to the emotional gravity of the night. "I demanded to share the reality of your world. I didn't want you to absorb the bullet for me, Dante." "And I told you," Dante replied, his words a deep, resonant rumble that resonated deeply in his chest, "that I am the only impenetrable wall between you and the men who want you dead. I did not step into the crossfire because you are weak, Clara. I did it because your survival is the only metric that justifies my existence." He turned his head slightly, looking over his uninjured shoulder to meet my eyes. The dark, possessive devotion in his gaze was entirely unguarded, completely stripped of the cold, calculating mask he wore for the syndicate. "You dismantled an entire logistics cartel with a laptop," he continued softly. "You froze the offshore accounts of a rival faction while sitting in the back of an SUV. You are the most terrifying, brilliant weapon in my arsenal. But my physical architecture is designed to absorb violence. Yours is not. We are partners. You build the firewalls, and I slaughter the monsters at the gates." A single tear finally escaped my lashes, slipping down my cheek to drop onto the dark marble floor. It wasn't a tear of panic or victimhood. It was the physical release of an exhaustion so profound it bordered on spiritual. For 8 long, agonizing months, I had carried the entire world on my shoulders. I had fought the medical billing departments. I had dodged the predatory gazes in corporate lobbies, and I had dragged my sister through the freezing rain. I leaned forward, pressing my lips gently against the unbruised skin of his right shoulder blade. The kiss was a silent, absolute vow. I finished cleaning the abrasions on his back, applying a thin layer of antibiotic ointment, before wrapping a wide, elastic compression bandage tightly around his torso to stabilize the fractured rib. My hands moved with a practiced, soothing rhythm, erasing the grit and the ash of the Queen's loading yard from his skin. When I was finished, I stood up, my bare feet aching on the hard stone. Dante stood slowly, his imposing height forcing me to tilt my head back. He didn't reach for a clean shirt. He reached for me. His uninjured left arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me flush against his bare, heated chest. I went willingly, sliding my arms around his neck, being incredibly careful not to press against his bruised ribs. He buried his face in my hair, inhaling deeply, his broad chest expanding against me. "You are safe," Dante murmured, his lips brushing against my temple, the words a heavy, absolute finality. "The Moretti ledger is permanently closed. The rogue executive is detained in the Brooklyn warehouse. The rival faction is entirely liquidated. The debt is ash." "I know," I whispered, closing my eyes, letting the rhythmic, powerful thud of his heart anchor my fractured nerves. "I know." We stood in the sprawling bathroom for a long time, the ambient heat of the floor seeping into my frozen toes, the silent, engineered perfection of the 58th floor vault, completely insulating us from the chaos of the city. There were no more digital firewalls to build. There were no more blocked numbers or desperate escapes into the freezing rain. Eventually, Dante picked me up, ignoring my quiet protests about his ribs, and carried me into the primary bedroom. He laid me down on the dark silk sheets, the incredibly soft fabric, feeling like a surreal luxury against my exhausted skin. He lay down beside me, pulling the heavy down comforter over us both, his massive frame curling protectively around my smaller one. His hand rested heavily on my hip, his thumb brushing slow, hypnotic circles against my side. The exhaustion finally claimed me, dragging me down into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first true, unguarded sleep I had experienced in nearly a decade. When I woke, the room was bathed in the soft, diffused, pale gray light of the late winter morning. The heavy, suffocating darkness of the blizzard had passed. I shifted slightly beneath the warm comforter. Dante was already awake, lying on his back, his whiskey eyes tracking the ceiling with a calm, calculating focus. He turned his head as I moved, his gaze instantly softening as it locked onto mine. I pushed myself up, the cheap olive green blouse I was still wearing wrinkled and ruined beyond repair. I didn't care. I slid out of the bed, the thick carpet soft beneath my bare feet, and walked over to the massive, reinforced glass window that stretched across the far wall of the bedroom. I looked out over the Manhattan skyline. The city was buried under a pristine, blinding blanket of fresh white snow, the chaotic filth and violence of the streets entirely concealed beneath a layer of glittering ice. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, utterly devoid of the storm clouds that had battered the high-rise the night before. From this elevation, 58 floors above the financial district, the world looked silent, orderly, and perfectly controlled. I raised my left hand, pressing my palm flat against the cold glass. The massive custom sapphire ring on my finger caught the morning sunlight, fracturing the beams into a dazzling kaleidoscopic display of deep oceanic blue and brilliant diamond white. The heavy padded footsteps of the syndicate boss approached from behind. Dante stopped right behind me, his immense muscular chest brushing against my back. He didn't wrap his arms around me. He respected the quiet sovereignty of the moment. He simply stood at my shoulder, a towering, immovable monument of dark devotion looking out at the same frozen city. Elena's medical trust has been fully funded, Dante stated softly, his voice a low, comforting vibration in the quiet room. The best pulmonary specialists in the country are reviewing her charts this morning. The Queen's apartment has been sterilized and abandoned. Your new secure servers are currently being installed in the library. I listened to his words, the sheer, staggering magnitude of his intervention washing over me like a warm tide. The crushing, solitary war I had fought for so long was definitively over. I turned my head slightly, looking at his sharp, aristocratic profile bathed in the morning light. The stark white compression bandage wrapping his ribs, and the fresh Oz on his hand, were physical proof that safety wasn't just handed out. It was bought with blood and absolute loyalty. Ours had started with blood and thunder, and a woman's stupid enough to open her door to danger. It had begun with a tiny structural flaw in a corporate ledger, and an explosive argument over my independence. But as I looked at the man who had torn the city apart to guarantee my peace, I realized that true autonomy didn't mean fighting alone, but finding someone strong enough to stand in the fire with you. He turned his head, his whiskey eyes locking on to mine with an absolute, unyielding devotion that eclipsed the morning sun. I rested my head against his shoulder, my fingers slipping into his as the brilliant blue sapphire caught the light. We were no longer two fractured souls fighting solitary wars in the dark. We were partners, equals, and together, we were ready to rule the empire we had saved.